They found Duke Cadric Ravenscar alone in the throne room at dawn, standing before his father's blood-soaked chair with a sword still dripping in his hand and eyes like winter graves. The entire court had fled. The royal guard lay dead across marble floors, and when the morning light cut through stained glass windows, illuminating his face beneath shadows sharp enough to draw blood, every witness understood one truth without speaking it aloud. The man who saved the kingdom by murdering everyone who tried to destroy it would never be forgiven for the mercy he refused to show. This is his story, the one they buried beneath lies. Stay until the end, because what you think you know about monsters is about to shatter like glass under an iron fist. The northern wind carried the stench of burnt flesh through Blackstone Keep's shattered windows 3 days after the massacre, and still nobody dared enter the West Tower where Duke Cadric Ravenscar had locked himself away from the living. Servants whispered in corridors lined with ancestral portraits now splattered with blood that wouldn't wash clean no matter how many times they scrubbed. The new Duke, 28 years old, trained in warfare since childhood, educated in 7 languages, and responsible for 73 confirmed deaths in a single night, had not emerged since his father's funeral, pyre burned down to ash and bone. Eleanor Ashford stood outside that locked door now, her knuckles white against the iron handle, listening to the absolute silence beyond. As the only surviving member of the King's Advisory Council, and the woman who had watched Cadric grow from an angry boy into something far more dangerous, she understood what everyone else refused to acknowledge. The kingdom hadn't been saved by a hero. It had been carved into submission by a weapon that finally slipped its leash. She knocked 3 times. Heavy, deliberate. No answer. Cadric? Her voice cut through the wood like a blade through silk. The lords are gathering in the Great Hall. They expect you to address them before sunset. Silence stretched until it became its own form of violence. Then his voice came through the door, low and scraped raw from 3 days without sleep. Let them wait. They won't wait much longer. Eleanor pressed her palm against the door, feeling the cold iron bite into her skin. Half the northern houses are already questioning whether you're fit to rule. The other half are preparing to challenge your claim outright. Your father kept them in line through fear and political marriages. You kept them in line by killing everyone who moved against the crown, but fear only works when the monster shows his face. The lock turned with a sound like breaking bones. The lock turned. Cadric opened the door halfway, and Eleanor's breath caught despite 20 years of court training teaching her to control such reactions. He looked like something dragged from the underworld and given human shape as punishment. His black hair hung loose past his shoulders, unwashed and tangled. 3 days of stubble darkened his jaw, but it was his eyes that made grown men step backward instinctively, pale gray, almost colorless, framed by shadows deep enough to drown in. Eyes that had watched his own father try to sell him to enemy houses as a political hostage when he was 16. Eyes that had counted every betrayal, memorized every slight, calculated every debt owed in blood. He wore the same black coat from the night of the purge, still stained with evidence of what he'd done to preserve a kingdom that hated him for it. Tell me something, Eleanor. He leaned against the doorframe with deceptive casualness, like a wolf pretending to be domesticated. When my father planned to execute me for refusing to marry the Thornfield girl, did you know? When Lord Bastion forged those letters trying to frame me for treason, did you know? When the entire fucking council decided I was too dangerous to live and hired assassins to kill me in my sleep, did you know? Eleanor's jaw tightened. I suspected. You suspected. Cadric's laugh was a brutal, ugly sound. And you did nothing. I did what I had to do to survive. Her voice turned to iron. Just like you. No. He pushed off the doorframe, moving with the fluid precision of a trained killer. I did what I had to do to win. There's a difference. Survival is for prey. I refuse to be prey ever again. He walked past her into the corridor, and Eleanor followed, matching his stride through halls that still smelled like death and expensive perfume. Servants pressed themselves against walls as he passed, their eyes tracking him with the wariness of people who understood they served a predator now. Not a lord, not a duke. Something else entirely. The lords will demand an explanation, Eleanor said quietly. 73 bodies don't bury themselves, Cadric. You killed members of the king's own council. You executed nobles without trial. I stopped a coup. His voice cut across hers like a whip. I prevented a civil war that would have torn this kingdom apart and left us vulnerable to invasion from 3 different borders. I did exactly what my father was too weak to do himself. And if they want an explanation, I'll give them one simple enough for even the most gutless nobleman to understand. He stopped walking, turning to face her with an expression that made her instinctively touch the knife hidden in her sleeve. I am Duke Cadric Ravenscar, commander of the Northern Armies, warden of the Blackstone Reach, and the only thing standing between this kingdom and complete annihilation. They will accept my rule, or they will join the corpses already rotting in the crypts. Those are the only 2 options available. Ichit. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, seeing past the brutality to the calculation beneath. The boy she'd watched grow up in this violent court had always been sharp, dangerous, too intelligent for his own survival. But the man standing before her now had shed every pretense of humanity that might have made him vulnerable. "You sound like your father," she said softly. Cadric's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind those pale eyes. Something that might have been pain if he hadn't learned to weaponize every weakness years ago. My father was a coward who built his power on political compromises and marriage alliances. He ruled through manipulation and whispered threats. When the enemies finally came for him, he tried to sacrifice his own son to save himself. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, more terrifying for its quietness. I am nothing like him. I rule through certainty, and when my enemies come for me, I'll already have buried them beneath the foundations of this keep. He continued walking, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the corridor, wondering not for the first time if she'd made a terrible mistake by helping him survive this long. The great hall sprawled beneath vaulted ceilings carved from obsidian and volcanic rock, built by Cadric's ancestors 300 years ago, when the Ravenscar family first claimed the northern territories through conquest and systematic extermination of rival houses. 47 lords waited beneath the ancient banners, dressed in formal court attire, their faces carefully arranged in expressions of neutral respect that didn't quite hide the fear and calculation moving beneath. Cadric entered without announcement, without ceremony, walking down the center aisle with the confidence of a man who knew every person in this room had tried to kill him at some point. The conversations died like candles in a storm. Lords who commanded armies stepped aside. Nobles who traced their bloodlines back to the founding of the kingdom lowered their eyes rather than meet his gaze directly. He ascended the dais in 3 measured strides and turned to face them, standing before his father's empty throne without sitting. The black chair loomed behind him like a tombstone marking the death of the old order. For a long moment he said nothing, just let the silence build until it became suffocating. Then Lord Garrett Thornfield, the eldest noble present, and a man who had survived 4 different regime changes through careful political neutrality, cleared his throat. "Your Grace," his voice echoed across the stone hall. "We are grateful for your decisive action in preventing the recent unpleasantness. However, certain questions must be addressed regarding the manner in which—" "No." The single word dropped like a headsman's axe. Lord Thornfield blinked. "Your Grace, I merely meant to suggest that—" "I don't care what you meant to suggest." Cadric's voice remained perfectly level, which somehow made it more menacing. "You're not here to question my methods. You're here to listen while I explain the new reality of how this kingdom will function moving forward. And if you interrupt me again, Thornfield, I'll have you removed from this hall in pieces." Someone gasped. Several nobles exchanged horrified glances, but nobody spoke. Nobody dared. Cadric continued as if he'd merely commented on the weather. "For 20 years, my father ruled the northern territories through weakness disguised as diplomacy. He allowed corrupt nobles to steal from the treasury. He ignored lords who sold grain meant for starving villages to foreign merchants for profit. He turned a blind eye to assassination attempts against his own family, because acknowledging them would have required him to actually execute people he'd shared wine with at dinner parties. He took a single step forward, and 47 men unconsciously stepped back. That ends now. Every lord in this hall who participated in the conspiracy against the crown has already been dealt with. The rest of you are alive because you were either innocent or smart enough to hide your involvement well enough that I couldn't prove it. Yet. Lord Marius Blackwell, a younger noble known more for his political ambition than his military prowess, raised his hand like a scholar, asking permission to speak. Your Grace, surely you don't expect us to believe that over 70 nobles were all conspirators. Some of those men were loyal to themselves. Caedric's eyes locked onto Blackwell with predatory focus. Just like you, Marius, every noble in this kingdom is loyal to their own house first, their own wealth second, and the stability of the realm somewhere around 7th on the list. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise. Blackwell's face flushed red, but he wisely kept his mouth shut. Here's what happens next, Caedric continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive hall. The Northern Territories will be reorganized under direct ducal oversight. Every house will submit financial records for the past 5 years. Every grain shipment will be accounted for. Every tax collected will be documented and verified. Any lord found guilty of corruption, theft, or conspiracy will be stripped of titles and lands immediately. Their holdings will be redistributed to houses that have demonstrated actual loyalty. He paused, letting that sink in. Furthermore, the private armies maintained by individual noble houses will be reduced by half and integrated into the ducal forces under my direct command. No lord will maintain forces large enough to threaten the stability of the realm. No house will conduct military operations without explicit approval from this throne. The murmuring started then, spreading through the assembled nobles like wildfire through dry grass. This wasn't reform. This was complete restructuring of the entire power system that had governed the North for centuries. Lord Edmund Veyrage, a grizzled military veteran who commanded the eastern border forces, stepped forward with the deliberate movements of a man who'd survived too many battles to be easily intimidated. With respect, Your Grace, what you're describing is not governance, it's tyranny. You're asking us to surrender the very autonomy that makes the Northern Lords effective defenders of the realm. Our families have held these territories for generations. We've bled for this kingdom. And now you want us to simply hand over our authority because you managed to murder your way to power? The hall went deathly quiet. Caedric descended from the dais slowly, each footstep echoing like a countdown. He walked until he stood directly in front of Veyrage, close enough that the older man could see the absolute emptiness behind those pale gray eyes. You're right, Edmund. His voice dropped to something that barely qualified as a whisper. Your family has held the Eastern Territories for 4 generations. Your grandfather fought beside my great-grandfather during the Sundering Wars. Your father saved my father's life at the Battle of Crimson Ridge. You've bled for this kingdom more than most men in this hall combined. He took one step closer. But your son Marcus was one of the assassins who tried to kill me 6 months ago. Your nephew Thomas forged the treasury documents that framed me for embezzlement. And your own brother Victor was the one who hired the mercenaries to ambush my convoy on the northern road last spring. Veyrage's face turned ashen. So yes, Edmund, I am asking you to surrender your autonomy, because the alternative is I execute you right here in front of everyone for conspiracy to commit regicide, hang your entire bloodline for treason, and burn your family's ancestral seat to the ground before sunrise. Those are your options. Choose quickly. Upoars? For a moment that stretched toward eternity, Edmund Veyrage stared into the eyes of the young duke who held his family's survival in one blood-stained hand. Then, slowly, he lowered himself to one knee. I submit to your authority, Your Grace. Good. Caedric didn't help him rise, just turned back to address the rest of the assembly, speaking over Veyrage's bowed head like he was a piece of furniture. Anyone else want to debate the definition of tyranny versus survival? No? Excellent. He returned to the dais, still refusing to sit on his father's throne. The king will arrive in 3 weeks to officially recognize my succession. Until then, this is how we proceed. Every house will send a detailed report of their military assets, financial holdings, and current political alliances directly to Eleanor Ashford, who will serve as my chief advisor. Any lord who fails to comply will be assumed to be hiding something worth killing them over. I've scheduled individual meetings with each of you over the next 10 days to discuss your specific roles in the new governing structure. He gripped the edge of the throne, his knuckles white against the black stone. Some of you think I'm a monster. You're right. Some of you think I'm too young, too brutal, too dangerous to control. You're right about that too. But here's what you're wrong about. You think this is personal. You think I killed 73 people because I'm unstable or vengeful or drunk on power? His voice turned cold enough to freeze blood. I killed them because they were threats to the stability of the realm, because every single one of them would have plunged this kingdom into civil war to advance their own ambitions. Because weak rulers create chaos, and chaos gets everyone killed. I don't care if you love me. I don't care if you respect me. I only care that when I give an order, you obey it without question. Because the alternative is we all burn together. He finally sat down on the throne, the Blackstone seeming to swallow him whole. This audience is over. Get out. The nobles fled like water, finding the fastest path downhill. Eleanor remained behind after the last lord disappeared through the massive doors, watching Caedric sit motionless on the throne that had destroyed his father and now threatened to destroy him. That was quite a performance, she said quietly, climbing the dais steps. Brutal, efficient, terrifying. Everything a young tyrant should be. Don't! His voice cracked slightly. Don't do that? Do what? Pretend this is some role I'm playing. Pretend I'm not exactly what they think I am. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, looking suddenly exhausted beneath the weight of everything he'd just claimed. I meant every word, Eleanor, every fucking word. And the worst part is, I don't even feel guilty about it anymore. Eleanor sat down on the steps beside the throne, something no advisor should ever do, looking up at the young man who carried too many scars for someone who'd barely lived 3 decades. Your father used to sit in that chair and lie to himself every night, she said softly. He'd tell himself he was a good ruler, a fair leader, a man who made difficult choices for noble reasons. He believed his own propaganda right up until the moment his son put a sword through his chest. Caedric flinched. You're not like him, Caedric. Not because you're more brutal or more honest or more willing to do terrible things. You're different because you understand exactly what you are, and you own it completely. That makes you either the best ruler this kingdom has ever seen, or the beginning of something so dark we'll all be consumed by it. Which do you think it is? He asked without looking at her. I don't know yet. Eleanor stood, brushing dust from her formal robes. But I'm going to stay close enough to find out. Someone needs to be here when you finally break. I won't break. Everyone breaks eventually. She walked toward the doors, her footsteps echoing across the empty hall. The question is what you'll do when it happens. Will you destroy everyone around you, or will you find some way to rebuild from the pieces? She left him alone in the throne room, surrounded by ancestral ghosts and fresh blood that wouldn't stop staining the marble, no matter how many times the servant scrubbed. 3 days later, Caedric stood in the eastern courtyard, watching his soldiers drill beneath a gray sky that threatened rain, but never delivered. The northern armies had always been the most disciplined forces in the kingdom, trained from childhood to fight in brutal mountain terrain against enemies who knew every pass and ambush point. But after the purge, morale hung by threads. Soldiers trained by men Caedric had personally executed now looked at their new duke with expressions that mixed fear and hatred in equal measure. Captain Marcus Steele approached across the training grounds, his armor dented from actual combat rather than ceremonial display. He'd served under Caedric's father for 15 years and had survived the transition by keeping his mouth shut and his sword sharp. Your Grace, he saluted formally. The eastern garrison reports increased activity along the border. Scouts from Thornfield have been testing our response times. They're probing for weakness. Caedric watched a young soldier fumble his pike drill, the weapon clattering to the ground. How many men have deserted since the succession? 47 from the Northern Regiment, 62 from the Western Forces, another 20 from the Keep's own guard. Steele's voice remained neutral, but the numbers spoke for themselves. Mained. Most waited until after your address to the lords before disappearing. Let them go. Caedric's tone was flat. Any soldier who serves out of loyalty to dead conspirators instead of duty to the realm is a liability waiting to put a knife in our backs. With respect, Your Grace, we can't afford to lose that many trained fighters. The spring campaign season approaches, and if Thornfield decides to test us seriously, then we'll kill them with the soldiers who remain. Better a smaller force united in purpose than a larger one riddled with traitors. He turned to face Steele directly. You think I'm being reckless? Say it. Steele hesitated only a moment. Yes, Your Grace. I think you're prioritizing fear over strategic necessity. Good. Kedrick's expression didn't change. That means you're still thinking for yourself instead of just agreeing with everything I say. Keep doing that. I need advisors who will tell me when I'm wrong, not courtiers who will smile while I destroy us all. Something shifted in Steele's posture. A slight relaxation, as if he'd been bracing for punishment and received something else entirely. In that case, Your Grace, I need to inform you that Lady Helena Thornfield has requested an audience. She arrived this morning with a small escort and refuses to leave until you see her. Kedrick went very still. Helena Thornfield, daughter of Lord Garrett, the man he'd threatened to dismember 3 days ago. The same woman his father had tried to force him to marry when he was 19, using the engagement as a political tool to cement alliances with one of the kingdom's wealthiest houses. He'd refused. His father had threatened to disown him. The engagement fell apart in scandal that damaged both families' reputations and created a rift that never fully healed. Where is she? The Rose Garden. She specifically asked to meet you there. Of course she did. The Rose Garden was where they'd first met as teenagers, before politics and violence had twisted everything into weapons. Tell her I'll see her in 1 hour, and Steele? Station guards outside the garden entrances. I don't trust the Thornfield family enough to meet any of them without insurance. Understood, Your Grace. An hour later, Kedrick walked through the garden's iron gates into a carefully cultivated wilderness of climbing roses and stone pathways that wound between ancient fountains. His mother had designed this space before she died, creating beauty in a place built for war. He rarely visited anymore. Too many memories of a childhood that ended the first time he watched his father execute a man for speaking truth to power. Helena stood beside the central fountain, her back to him, wearing a deep emerald dress that marked her as nobility without requiring ostentatious displays of wealth. Her dark hair fell in careful waves past her shoulders, and when she turned at the sound of his footsteps, her face was exactly as he remembered: sharp cheekbones, intelligent eyes, and an expression that always seemed to see through whatever mask he wore. Kedrick. Her voice carried across the garden like a challenge. Still lurking in shadows and avoiding daylight, I see. Helena. He stopped several feet away, maintaining distance like they were circling for a duel. Still showing up uninvited and making demands like you have any authority here. Her smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Sir, some things never change, though I heard you've changed quite a bit. 73 bodies worth of change, if the rumors are accurate. The rumors are low. It was 86 by the time we finished cleaning the crypts. She didn't flinch. Most noble women would have gasped or shown some sign of shock. Helena just nodded like he'd confirmed something she'd already calculated. My father thinks you're going to execute him within the month. Half the court agrees. They say you've become exactly what everyone always feared you'd be, a weapon without a leash, ruling through terror instead of wisdom. And what do you think? He asked, genuinely curious. I think you did what you had to do to survive. And I think you're about to make a series of catastrophic mistakes because you're so focused on eliminating threats that you can't see the kingdom crumbling around you. Kedrick laughed, the sound harsh and humorless. You came all this way to insult me? There are people in line for that privilege, Helena. You'll have to wait your turn. Well, Mom, I came to make you an offer. She moved closer, her footsteps precise against the stone path. The Thornfield family controls 3 major trade routes, 2 mining operations, and enough political influence to either support your rule or make your life significantly more difficult. My father may be a cautious old man, but he's not stupid. He knows the kingdom needs stability more than it needs pride. So he sent his daughter to negotiate. Kedrick's eyes narrowed. What are the terms? Get married. Marriage. The word hung between them like a blade. You can't be serious. Completely serious. Helena stopped just within arm's reach, close enough that he could see the calculation behind her calm expression. You need legitimacy. You need political alliances that aren't built on fear alone, and whether you want to admit it or not, You need someone who understands how to navigate court politics without murdering everyone who disagrees with you. I don't need anything except obedience and time, he said coldly. You need an heir. Her voice dropped to something more intimate, more dangerous. You're 28 years old, ruling a territory that 3 different enemy houses would love to claim. If you die tomorrow without a designated successor, this kingdom tears itself apart in civil war within a week. You know it's true. She was right. He hated that she was right. This isn't 9 years ago, Helena. I'm not the same person your father tried to manipulate through marriage alliances. And you're not the idealistic girl who thought she could change me through patience and understanding. No, she agreed. I'm the woman who spent the last 9 years watching you become exactly what you needed to be to survive this court. I'm the woman who understands that monsters aren't born. They're created by circumstances that leave them no other choice. And I'm the woman who's willing to stand beside the most dangerous man in the kingdom because I'd rather shape the future than watch it burn from a safe distance. Kedrick studied her face, searching for deception, manipulation, any sign that this was another elaborate trap designed to destroy him. But all he saw was brutal honesty wrapped in political calculation. She wasn't offering love, she was offering alliance. If I agreed, he held up a hand as she started to respond. If. What exactly are you asking for in return? Protection for my family, a seat on your advisory council, and a promise that when you inevitably make decisions that could destroy us all, you'll at least listen to someone who isn't terrified to tell you the truth. I have Eleanor for that. Eleanor is brilliant, but she's loyal to the kingdom first, not to you. I'm offering something different. Someone who will stand with you even when you're wrong. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing a ruler can face isn't external enemies. It's the isolation that comes from everyone either fearing you or plotting against you. A gust of wind scattered rose petals across the stone path between them, red against gray like blood on marble. I'll consider it, Kedrick said finally. But Helena, understand this. If you betray me, if your family uses this marriage to gain leverage and then turns that leverage into a weapon, I will bury House Thornfield so deep that archaeologists won't find the ruins for centuries. That's not a threat. It's a fact. I wouldn't expect anything less. She smiled, and for just a moment, he saw the girl he'd once known, before the violence, before the betrayals, before they both learned that survival required becoming people they'd once have despised. One more thing, Kedrick. What? The king arrives in 3 weeks to officially recognize your succession. When he does, he's bringing his youngest daughter with him. Kedrick froze. Lady Seraphina Arden, the disgraced noble's daughter, whose family had been destroyed during his father's purge of the southern houses 5 years ago. She'd been 13 when her father tried to lead a rebellion against the crown. The king had crushed the uprising personally, executing Lord Arden and scattering his family to various monasteries and remote estates as political prisoners disguised as protective custody. Why would the king bring her here? Helena's expression turned grim. Because he's heard the same rumors everyone else has, that you're unstable, unpredictable, dangerous, and he's bringing Lady Seraphina as an offering, a political marriage to bind you to the crown through chains of obligation and family alliance. The king wants me to marry a girl whose father I helped hunt down and execute? Kedrick's laugh was bitter. That's insane, even by royal standards. It's brilliant, Helena corrected. If you refuse, you insult the king and give him justification to question your loyalty. If you accept, you're bound to a woman who has every reason to hate you and excellent motivation to put a knife in your back the first chance she gets. Either way, the king regains control over the northern territories without firing a single arrow. Kedrick walked to this fountain's edge, staring into water that reflected his face like a dark mirror. Everything he'd done to secure his position, every life he'd taken to prevent civil war, all of it could unravel because of political marriages and calculated betrayals wrapped in silk and perfume. What do you suggest? He asked without turning around. Hisham, marry me first. Helena's voice was steady. Make the announcement tomorrow. By the time the king arrives, it's already done. He can't force you into a marriage that would be bigamy, and the Thornfield alliance gives you enough political cover to refuse without open insult. You're asking me to use you as a shield. I'm asking you to let me stand where I choose to stand. There's a difference." He turned to face her, this woman who'd once represented everything soft and breakable in a world that destroyed such things. She stood straight-backed and unflinching, meeting his gaze without fear or hesitation. "I'll give you my answer in 2 days," he said finally. "Until then, you're a guest of Blackstone Keep. I'll have chambers prepared in the North Wing. The North Wing is where you keep political hostages disguised as honored guests." Yes, it is." He smiled, the expression cold and precise, which makes it perfect for a woman offering a marriage alliance built on mutual survival instead of trust. "Don't mistake my consideration for sentimentality, Helena. I stopped believing in fairy tales the same day I learned my father planned to sell me to save himself." She nodded once, accepting the terms without argument. 2 days, Cedric, but decide quickly, because whether you marry me, the king's daughter, or no one at all, the war is coming. The question is whether you'll face it alone or with allies who actually understand what they're signing up for. Helena left the garden in a rustle of emerald silk. Leaving Cedric alone with his reflection and the weight of choices that would either save the kingdom or condemn it to flames. That night, in his private chambers, Cedric stood before the window overlooking Blackstone Keep's walls and the valleys beyond. Eleanor found him there an hour before midnight, staring into darkness like a man searching for answers written in starlight. "You're considering the Thornfield girl's offer," she said without preamble. "How did you know?" "Because you haven't executed Lord Garrett yet. If you'd decided against the alliance, his head would already be decorating the gates." Eleanor poured herself wine from the side table. Eleanor, not bothering to ask permission. "Are you going to accept?" "I don't know." The admission felt like weakness. Everything she said makes sense politically, but marriage means vulnerability. It means giving someone access to the one part of myself I've kept locked away from this entire kingdom. Your humanity? But he shot her a sharp look. "Don't romanticize it. I'm not protecting some precious core of goodness. I'm protecting the parts of myself that could be used as weapons against me. Love, trust, hope. Every one of them is a liability in a world where survival requires constant vigilance." "Then why are you still alive?" Eleanor asked softly. "If you truly believed that, you would have died years ago." "Cedric, listen to me carefully. Your father ruled through fear for 20 years. And in the end, his own court turned on him because people can only live in terror for so long before they decide death is preferable. You can be brutal. You can be merciless. You can execute every traitor and burn every conspiracy to ash. But if you don't give the kingdom something to believe in besides your capacity for violence, you'll end up just like him, betrayed by the very people you're trying to protect." "What am I supposed to give them?" His voice cracked slightly. "Hope? Compassion? I killed 86 people in 3 days, Eleanor. I watched men who served my father for decades beg for mercy, and I gave the execution order without hesitation. Whatever capacity I had for kindness died the same night. I realized everyone I ever trusted was either trying to kill me or using me as a pawn in political games I didn't even know existed." Eleanor set down her wine glass and crossed to where he stood, placing one hand on his shoulder in a gesture that would have gotten anyone else killed for the presumption. "Then find someone who can survive you," she said quietly. "Not someone weak enough to break. Not someone strong enough to challenge you for power. Someone who can stand beside the monster you've become and see the man you might still be underneath. Helena Thornfield isn't that person. She's too calculated, too political. She'll be an excellent ally and a competent duchess. But she won't save you from the darkness. I don't need saving. Whereas, everyone needs saving, Cedric. Even monsters. Especially monsters." She left him alone with those words, and Cedric returned to staring at the darkness beyond the window, wondering if salvation was even possible for someone who'd built their throne on corpses and called it justice. 2 days passed in a blur of military reports, political meetings, and carefully orchestrated displays of power meant to remind the northern lords that their new duke was not to be trifled with. On the evening of the second day, Cedric summoned Helena to his private study, a room lined with maps and military records and shelves full of books his mother had collected before she died. Helena entered without knocking, closing the door behind her and taking the seat he indicated without waiting for permission. "You've made your decision." It wasn't a question. "Yes." He poured 2 glasses of wine, sliding one across the desk toward her. "I'll accept the marriage alliance. We'll make the announcement tomorrow at the evening assembly. The ceremony will take place 3 days before the king arrives, giving us enough time to present it as a fait accompli without obvious insult." Miss Helena's expression remained carefully neutral. "Very practical." "That's all this is, Helena. A practical arrangement between 2 people who understand that survival requires setting aside personal desires in favor of political necessity. I won't love you. I probably won't even like you most days. But I will honor the terms of our agreement, and I will defend House Thornfield as I would defend my own." "What? Fair enough." She picked up the wine glass but didn't drink. "Then let me be equally clear about my expectations. I don't need you to love me, Cedric. I don't need romance or poetry or gentle words whispered in the dark. But I do need honesty. If you're going to make decisions that affect both our lives, I expect to be informed before, not after. If you're planning to execute someone connected to my family, I want advance notice. And if you're going to drag us into a war that could get us all killed, I deserve to understand why." I said, agreed. He raised his glass. "To a marriage built on brutal honesty and mutual survival instead of the comfortable lies that destroyed our parents' generation." She finally smiled, and they drank together in the study that smelled like old books and new beginnings forged in blood and calculation. 3 days later, Cedric stood in the cathedral beneath stained glass windows that cast colored light across marble floors still bearing faint bloodstains from the purge. The assembled nobles watched in silence as he and Helena exchanged vows in a ceremony stripped of warmth and pageantry. This wasn't a celebration. It was a political declaration wrapped in religious protocol. When the priest asked if anyone objected to the union, Cedric's hand rested visibly on his sword hilt. Nobody spoke. The ceremony ended with Helena wearing House Ravenscar's ancestral ring, a band of black iron set with a single pale stone that resembled a frozen tear. They left the cathedral as Duke and Duchess without fanfare, without celebration, without any pretense that this marriage was anything except a calculated move on a political chessboard where every piece was expendable. That night, standing on the battlements overlooking the northern valleys, Eleanor found him alone again. "Congratulations, Your Grace. You're now tied to one of the most powerful families in the kingdom. I'm sure you're thrilled." "I feel exactly nothing," he said flatly, which is probably the healthiest response to a marriage that exists purely for strategic positioning. "The king arrives in 3 weeks. When he brings Lady Seraphina Arden, what will you tell him?" Cedric was silent for a long moment, watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. "I'll tell him the truth, that I'm already married, that his offer is declined with appropriate gratitude, and that if he has a problem with my choice of Duchess, he's welcome to bring his armies north, and we can settle the disagreement the way our ancestors did, with blood and steel. That's not going to end well. Nothing about my life ends well, Eleanor. The best I can hope for is that when everything finally collapses, I take my enemies down with me." Thunder rumbled across the valley, and the first drops of rain began to fall like tears from a sky that had witnessed too many betrayals to believe in redemption anymore. In the castle below, Helena stood in her new chambers staring at the ring on her finger and wondering if she'd just saved the kingdom or married the man who would destroy it. And far to the south, in a carriage traveling north under royal escort, a young woman with auburn hair and eyes like winter storms sat reading by candlelight, unaware that her arrival would shatter everything Duke Cedric Ravenscar had built to protect himself from the one thing he feared more than death itself. Connection, the kind that turned monsters back into men, and men into something far more dangerous than monsters ever could be. The royal carriage arrived exactly 3 weeks after Cedric's wedding, rolling through Blackstone Keep's gates under storm clouds that hung low enough to taste metal in the air. 70 mounted guards accompanied the procession, their armor polished to mirror brightness despite the journey through mountain passes still muddy from spring thaw. The king's banners snapped in the wind like whips cracking, and every servant in the courtyard kept their eyes lowered as the procession came to a halt. Caedric stood on the main steps in full formal attire, black coat trimmed with silver that caught the dim light like blade edges. Helena positioned herself exactly one step behind and to his left, the placement of a duchess who understood power dynamics without needing instruction. Eleanor waited further back with the assembled lords, all of them dressed in their finest clothes and wearing expressions that revealed absolutely nothing. The carriage door opened. King Aldrich emerged first, a man in his 60s who'd ruled through 3 separate succession crises and 2 attempted coups with the kind of ruthless pragmatism that made Caedric look merciful by comparison. He wore simple traveling clothes that somehow managed to convey more authority than any crown. His eyes swept across the assembled nobles with the assessment of someone calculating which pieces on the board were still useful and which could be sacrificed. Then she stepped down from the carriage, and everything Caedric thought he understood about control shattered like glass under a hammer. Lady Seraphina Arden looked nothing like the traumatized child he remembered from her father's execution 5 years ago. She moved with careful precision, each step measured as though the ground might collapse beneath her if she showed weakness. Auburn hair pulled back in a severe style that emphasized sharp cheekbones and a jaw set with the kind of tension that came from years of holding back screams. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Winter gray, almost colorless, meeting his gaze without flinching despite every reason she had to hate him on sight. She wore deep burgundy, the color of old blood, and no jewelry except a single silver chain that disappeared beneath her collar. Everything about her screamed restraint barely maintained, like a blade wrapped in silk, waiting for the moment someone gave her permission to cut. Caedric descended the steps with Helena matching his pace, their unified approach a deliberate statement. Married, unavailable, case closed. King Aldrich smiled like a man watching his favorite hunting dog circle prey. Your Grace? The king's voice carried across the courtyard with practiced ease. We are honored by your hospitality. May I present Lady Seraphina Arden, ward of the crown and daughter of the late Lord Thomas Arden. The title was a slap wrapped in courtesy. Daughter of a traitor, reminder of rebellion, walking proof that mercy had limits and the king never forgot. Caedric bowed with exactly the depth protocol demanded, and not an inch further. Your Majesty, you honor Blackstone with your presence. May I present my wife, Duchess Helena Ravenscar. He felt Seraphina's attention shift to Helena with the focus of someone cataloging potential threats, saw the minute calculation behind those pale eyes as she processed the marriage announcement nobody had warned her about. Her expression never changed, didn't twitch, didn't reveal anything except the absolute control it took to maintain that emptiness. The king's smile widened slightly. Your wife. How delightfully unexpected. I had hoped to discuss certain political arrangements during my visit, but it appears you've already made your choice. How very decisive of you. The words dripped with implication sharp enough to draw blood. Stability requires clarity, Your Majesty. Caedric kept his voice level. I thought it best to eliminate any ambiguity regarding succession and alliance before the spring campaign season begins. Of course. King Aldrich gestured toward the keep's entrance. Perhaps we might continue this discussion somewhere more comfortable. Lady Seraphina has traveled far and would benefit from rest before tonight's formal dinner. Seraphina hadn't moved, just stood there watching Caedric with an intensity that made his skin crawl in ways that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. She looked at him the way he looked at maps before battle, searching for weaknesses, calculating angles of attack, planning 3 moves ahead. She saw exactly what he was. And she wasn't afraid. That realization settled into his chest like a knife finding space between ribs. The feast that night sprawled across the great hall with enough food and wine to feed a small army. Nobles from every major house gathered beneath the vaulted ceilings, all of them dressed in formal finery that couldn't quite hide the tension crackling through the air like lightning before a storm. The king sat at the high table between Caedric and Helena, with Seraphina positioned directly across from them, where she could be observed constantly. She ate sparingly, spoke only when directly addressed, and watched everything with the careful attention of someone who'd learned survival required constant vigilance. Twice, Caedric caught her gaze drifting to the exits. 3 times he noticed her cataloging which guard stood where. She was mapping the space for escape routes or attack positions, And the fact that he recognized it meant they'd been trained by similar circumstances to view every room as potential battlefield. Lord Garrett Thornfield, emboldened by wine and his daughter's new position, leaned forward to address the king directly. "Your Majesty, if I may be so bold, what prompted you to bring Lady Seraphina north? Surely the southern estates would provide more suitable accommodations for a young woman of her station." The king's smile never reached his eyes. Lady Seraphina requested the journey herself. She expressed a desire to see more of the kingdom beyond monastery walls. "I thought it prudent to honor her wishes, given her family's past service to the crown." Cedric's attention snapped to Seraphina. She requested this, not a political pawn being moved across the board. A player making her own moves. Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them. Understanding. Recognition. The silent acknowledgement of two people who'd learned to read violence in the spaces between words. Helena's hand found his beneath the table, squeezing once in warning. He was staring too long, revealing too much interest, breaking the careful performance of a man happily married and thoroughly uninterested in the king's ward. "Tell me, Lady Seraphina." Helena's voice cut through the moment like a blade through flesh. "What did you hope to find in the Northern Territories? We're somewhat lacking in the cultural refinements you might be accustomed to." Seraphina set down her wine glass with precise movements. "I find that culture is often just another word for comfortable lies, Your Grace. The North has a reputation for brutal honesty. I wanted to see if that reputation was earned or merely propaganda designed to intimidate." Several nobles went very quiet. "And your conclusion?" Cedric asked, despite knowing he shouldn't engage. Seraphina's gaze locked onto his with the impact of a physical blow. "I think the North is exactly as brutal as advertised. But I also think brutality is simply honesty stripped of the pretense that violence can be civilized through better manners and softer words." Helena's grip tightened on his hand beneath the table. The king laughed, breaking the tension like a stone through ice. "Well said, my dear. Perhaps you'll fit in better here than I anticipated, though I notice you've developed quite an edge during your time in monastery contemplation. One might almost think you were angry about something." Seraphina smiled, and it was the most dangerous expression Cedric had seen in years. "Anger requires caring about outcomes, Your Majesty. I simply learned to observe without expectation. It's remarkable how clearly you can see when you stop hoping things will be different than they are." The dinner continued for another 3 hours, political posturing and careful conversations that revealed nothing while implying everything. By the time guests began departing, Cedric's jaw ached from maintaining neutral expressions, and his patience had worn thinner than parchment. He found Eleanor in the corridor outside the Great Hall, watching servants clear tables with the efficient brutality of people who understood that leaving work unfinished invited punishment. "The king is testing you," she said without preamble. "He brought her here specifically to destabilize whatever control you think you've established. Every interaction is being calculated to see how you respond." "I'm aware." Cedric rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a headache that had nothing to do with wine. "What's his endgame?" Eleanor leaned against the stone wall, her formal robes abandoned for practical clothes that allowed easier movement. "He wants to know if you're controllable. Your father could be manipulated through pride and fear of losing status. The king maintained power over the Northern Territories by threatening to strip titles and redistribute lands to more loyal houses. But you've already burned that playbook. You don't care about reputation. You've killed enough nobles that threatening your status means nothing. So he's trying a different approach. Connection. The word tasted like poison. He's trying to give me something to lose." "Exactly." Eleanor's expression turned grim. Helena was the safe choice, a political alliance built on mutual benefit with clear boundaries. But Seraphina Arden is something else entirely. She's a mirror, Cedric. She survived the same kind of trauma you did, watched her family destroyed, learned that the world is brutal and mercy is weakness. And the king knows that meeting someone who understands that specific kind of damage is infinitely more dangerous than any political marriage could ever be. "I'm already married. The alliance is set. There's no leverage there. You think that matters?" Eleanor pushed off the wall, moving closer until he could see the genuine concern in her eyes. "The king doesn't need you to marry her. He just needs you to care whether she lives or dies. Once you care, you're vulnerable. Once you're vulnerable, you can be controlled. And if you can be controlled, the Northern Territories fall back under royal authority without a single battle." Kadrick stared at her for a long moment, processing the implications. So what do I do? Nothing. Eleanor's voice turned hard. You do absolutely nothing. You treat her like any other guest. You maintain appropriate distance. You let the king realize his strategy failed and depart peacefully in 3 days. And most importantly, you don't spend time alone with her under any circumstances, because that woman is either the smartest player at this table or the most damaged, and either way, she's exactly the kind of threat you can't afford. Understood. But that night, standing at his window overlooking the northern valleys, Kaedric couldn't stop thinking about the way Serafina had looked at him. Not with fear, not with hatred. With recognition so complete it felt like drowning. He found her 2 days later in the archives. It wasn't intentional. He'd gone searching for military records from the spring campaigns 3 years prior, needing confirmation on troop movements before committing to his own strategic plans. The archives occupied the lowest levels of Blackstone Keep, carved directly into the mountain stone where temperature remained constant year-round to preserve documents dating back centuries. She sat at a corner table surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, her hair loose around her shoulders and ink staining her fingers. Candlelight caught the angles of her face, and for a moment she looked younger than whatever age she'd managed to survive to. Maybe 22, maybe 23. Young enough that the trauma should have broken her completely instead of forging her into something sharp enough to draw blood. She looked up when his footsteps echoed across stone floors, and her expression didn't change. Didn't show surprise or fear or anything except that same careful assessment. Your Grace. Her voice remained level. I apologize if I'm trespassing. The Master of Records gave me permission to review historical documents regarding southern trade routes. Kadrick crossed to the shelves he needed, pulling down ledgers while keeping her in peripheral vision. You're not trespassing. These archives are open to guests with appropriate clearance. How generous! The words carried an edge sharp enough to cut. Though I noticed the sections regarding executions and political purges are locked behind iron gates with armed guards. He turned to face her directly. Those sections contain sensitive information regarding ongoing security matters, not appropriate for general review. Of course. Serafina set down her quill, leaning back in her chair with deliberate casualness. Wouldn't want anyone reading about how thoroughly you dismantled the conspiracy against your father, or how many of those nobles begged for mercy before you gave the execution orders. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. You sound almost admiring. Kadrick moved closer, setting his ledgers on the table across from her. Most people find that particular chapter of history distasteful at best. Most people are hypocrites. Her eyes met his without flinching. They benefit from the stability your brutality created while condemning the methods that made it possible. I find that particular form of cowardice more repulsive than honest violence. And what's your relationship with honest violence, Lady Serafina? She smiled, and it was the kind of expression that belonged on battlefields. I watched my father hang for treason when I was 13 years old. Watched the crown strip our family of everything except shame and the dubious mercy of monastery imprisonment. Spent 5 years learning that survival requires becoming someone your childhood self would have feared. So my relationship with violence is intimate, familiar, and completely devoid of the illusions that most noble women cling to about the world being fair or kind or remotely interested in rewarding goodness. Kadrick sat down across from her, abandoning all pretense of maintaining appropriate distance. Why did you come here? The real reason. Serafina was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns in spilled ink on the wooden table. Because the king thinks he can use me as leverage against you. Because I spent 5 years in a monastery being trained to be grateful for survival while slowly going insane from boredom and supervised prayers. And because when I heard rumors about the ruthless duke who killed everyone who threatened him and somehow kept the kingdom from tearing itself apart, I wanted to meet the only person in this entire realm who might actually understand what it costs to become the kind of monster that survival demands. The candles flickered, casting shadows that turned the archives into something almost intimate. I'm married. The words came out rougher than intended. I know. Her gaze never wavered. I'm not here to seduce you or manipulate you into some political alliance. I'm here because for 5 years I've been surrounded by people who think survival is about maintaining dignity and quiet suffering. And I wanted to meet someone who understood that survival is actually about becoming so dangerous that the world thinks twice before trying to destroy you again. You think that's what I am? Dangerous enough that the world backs down? Serafina leaned forward, her voice dropping to something that felt like a secret shared in darkness. I think you're a weapon that learned to wield itself. I think you turned trauma into strategy and pain into power. And I think you're so goddamn lonely in that transformation that you can't even admit it to yourself anymore. The words hit like physical blows. You don't know anything about me. But his voice lacked conviction. I know you stand at your window every night staring at valleys you're supposed to protect, while wondering if the kingdom would be better off if you died alongside everyone you executed. I know you married for political stability instead of connection, because connection means vulnerability, and vulnerability is the only weakness you can't afford. And I know that right now, sitting across from someone who actually understands the specific kind of damage required to survive what we survived, you're terrified because for the first time in years, you feel something other than calculated emptiness. Kaedric stood abruptly, the chair scraping against stone. This conversation is over. Is it? Serafina remained seated, head tilted slightly. Or are you just running before you have to admit I'm right? He left without answering, climbing stairs 2 at a time until he reached the main levels where servants and guards provided witnesses to appropriate behavior. His heart pounded against his ribs with something that felt dangerously close to panic, and he hated her for stripping away defenses he'd spent years building. Helena found him an hour later in their shared chambers, pacing like a caged wolf. You spoke with her. Not a question. Kaedric stopped moving. How did you know? Because you look like someone who just realized the walls they built to keep the world out might also be keeping them trapped inside. Helena moved to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. What did she say? Nothing that matters. Everything that mattered. The truth he couldn't admit. She's leaving with the king tomorrow. This entire situation resolves itself in 12 hours. And until then I avoid her completely. Maintain distance. Let the king realize his strategy failed. He forced himself to breathe normally. This changes nothing, Helena, doesn't it? She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. I've known you for 9 years, Kaedric. Watched you transform from an angry boy into the most dangerous man in the kingdom. And in all that time, I've never seen you look at anyone the way you looked at her during that dinner. Like she was a mirror reflecting everything you've tried to bury. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. Helena crossed to where he stood, reaching up to touch his face with surprising gentleness. And here's what makes this truly terrible. I'm not even angry about it. Because I agreed to marry you for political alliance, not romance. I knew exactly what I was signing up for. But that girl down in the archives? She didn't sign up for anything. She's a weapon the king is wielding against you, and if you're not careful, she'll cut you deeper than any enemy ever could. She's leaving tomorrow, he repeated, but the words felt hollow. For now. Helena dropped her hand, moving toward the door. But we both know the king doesn't give up that easily. This was just the opening move, Kaedric. The real game is only beginning. She left him alone with thoughts that wouldn't settle, and a tension in his chest that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with a woman who'd looked at him like she could see straight, through to the damaged core he'd spent years pretending didn't exist. The king departed at dawn with appropriate ceremony and veiled threats wrapped in diplomatic courtesy. Kaedric stood on the steps watching the procession roll through the gates, 70 mounted guards surrounding the royal carriage like a moving fortress. He told himself it was over, that Serafina Arden would return to her monastery prison or wherever the king stashed inconvenient nobles who'd outlived their immediate usefulness. Then she turned in his carriage doorway, meeting his eyes across the courtyard with an expression that promised absolutely nothing and implied everything. She was coming back. The certainty settled into his bones like prophecy. 3 weeks passed in careful routine, military drills, political meetings. Helena navigating court politics with the skill of someone born to manipulation, while Kaedric focused on reorganizing the northern defenses against spring raids from rival territories. They fell into patterns that resembled a functional marriage from the outside, while remaining essentially separate on the inside. Respectful, professional, completely devoid of anything resembling actual intimacy. He tried not to think about Serafina. Failed consistently. Eleanor noticed, because Eleanor noticed everything. You're distracted. She cornered him after a council meeting where he'd approved military expenditures without his usual detailed interrogation of every line item. That's dangerous for someone in your position. I'm fine. You're compromised. Eleanor's voice dropped to something more gentle than usual. And before you tell me again that it doesn't matter because she's gone, you should know that Lady Seraphina Arden has taken up residence at the Thornwood estate approximately 40 miles south of here. Apparently, the king granted her permission to live outside monastery supervision, provided she remains within the northern territories where you can keep an eye on her. Kedrick went very still. That's convenient. That's calculated. Eleanor moved closer, her expression grim. The king is leaving her close enough to be accessible, but far enough away that any contact appears intentional rather than coincidental. If you ride out to see her, everyone will know. If she visits the keep, it becomes official court business. Every interaction will be witnessed, documented, and used against you. Then I won't interact with her. Can you do that? Eleanor asked quietly. Can you actually maintain that distance, knowing she's 40 miles away instead of 3 kingdoms distant? He wanted to say yes. Wanted to believe his control was absolute, and this was just another political complication to navigate through avoidance and careful strategy. But the truth lodged in his throat like a blade. I don't know. The answer felt like surrender. That night he dreamed about the archives, about candlelight and ink-stained fingers and eyes that saw through every defense he'd built. Woke before dawn with his heart pounding and Helena's absence from their shared bed, a reminder that even his marriage was a performance of connection rather than the reality of it. He lasted 6 days. On the 7th, he saddled his horse before sunrise and rode south with minimal escort, telling himself he was inspecting border fortifications, and the fact that the route passed near Thornwood estate was pure coincidence. Captain Steele accompanied him because protocol demanded it, staying 3 lengths behind and keeping his observations to himself. The Thornwood estate sat nestled in a valley between forested hills, a modest stone manor that had belonged to a minor noble family before the purge. Now it served as polite imprisonment for the king's ward, comfortable enough to appear generous while isolated enough to limit her influence. Kedrick dismounted at the gates, and the guards recognized him immediately. No announcement needed. Doors opened like water parting before a blade. He found her in the garden behind the manor, wearing simple clothes and working soil with her bare hands like a commoner instead of nobility. Her hair was tied back carelessly, and dirt smudged her cheek. She looked more real than anyone he'd seen in years. She didn't look up when his boots crunched on the gravel path, just kept working, hands deep in earth. Your Grace, her voice remained level. To what do I owe the unexpected honor? I was inspecting fortifications. The lie tasted bitter. Thought I'd ensure you were settling in appropriately. How thoughtful. Seraphina finally stood, brushing dirt from her hands with deliberate slowness. And here I thought you might have come because you spent the last 6 days trying to convince yourself that what I said in the archives was wrong. Kedrick moved closer despite every instinct screaming at him to maintain distance. And was it wrong? She met his eyes and the impact nearly staggered him. No. It was probably the most honest thing anyone said to you in years. That's why you're here. Because honesty is more dangerous than any political threat, and you can't figure out if you want to destroy me for seeing through you or surrender to the relief of being actually understood for once in your goddamn life. The garden seemed to shrink until the entire world consisted of 2 people who'd survived by becoming weapons and couldn't figure out how to be human again. I'm married. The words came out desperate. I know. Seraphina stepped closer, close enough that he could see gold flecks in her gray eyes. And I'm the king's political hostage disguised as his ward. We're both trapped in circumstances designed to control us. But right here, right now, we could be honest about what this is instead of pretending it doesn't exist. And what is this? Recognition. Her voice dropped to something raw. 2 people who got broken in similar ways discovering they're not as alone as they thought. That's not love, Kedrick. It's not even particularly healthy, but it's real in a way that nothing else in our carefully constructed political lives can ever be. His hand came up to her face without conscious decision, fingers tracing the line of her jaw while his brain screamed warnings about witnesses and consequences and the careful control that kept him alive. This is a mistake. But he didn't pull away. Probably. She leaned into the touch with the hunger of someone who'd been starving for contact that didn't come wrapped in manipulation. But we've both made worse mistakes in the name of survival. At least this one feels like choosing something instead of just enduring what we're given. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the careful political kiss he'd given Helena during their wedding ceremony. This was honest, desperate, Two people who'd learned to weaponize every vulnerability, discovering what happened when they lowered their guards simultaneously. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kaedric forced himself to step back before he did something irreversible. "I can't do this." His voice came out rougher than intended. "I won't risk everything I've built for... For what?" Seraphina's expression turned fierce. "For connection? For the possibility that maybe you're not just a weapon pretending to be human? Don't insult us both by acting like this is about risk assessment, Kaedric. You didn't ride 40 miles to inspect fortifications. You came because 6 days of trying to forget me failed completely." She was right. They both knew it. What do you want from me?" The question came out broken. "I want you to stop pretending you're fine with being alone forever." Seraphina moved closer again, her voice dropping to something that felt like a dare. "I want you to admit that marrying Helena was the safe choice, and safe choices are for people who haven't already survived the worst possible outcomes. And I want you to acknowledge that what's happening between us scares you more than any enemy army, because it's the one thing your brutal honesty and calculated strategy can't protect you from." He stared at her for a long moment, seeing himself reflected in those winter-gray eyes. The truth he couldn't speak. The weakness he couldn't afford. The desperate hunger for connection that he'd buried so deep, he'd almost convinced himself it didn't exist. "I have to go." He turned toward the path before he said something that would shatter everything. "This can't happen again." "Yes, it can." Her voice followed him like a blade. "Because you'll come back. Maybe in a week, maybe in a month. But you'll come back because I'm the only person in this entire kingdom who looks at the monster you've become and sees the man you still are underneath. And that's more addictive than any political power could ever be." He rode back to Blackstone Keep in silence, Captain Steele maintaining distance and asking no questions. By the time the castle walls came into view, Kaedric had almost convinced himself that he could maintain control, that this was manageable, that he wouldn't go back. He lasted 11 days. The pattern established itself with brutal efficiency over the next 3 months. Kaedric would last anywhere from 8 to 14 days before finding reasons to ride south, inspecting grain shipments, reviewing border security, meeting with minor lords whose estates happened to fall along routes that passed Thornwood. Each time he told himself it would be the last. Each time he was wrong. Seraphina never asked him to come, never sent messages or made demands. She simply existed 40 miles away like gravity, pulling at something inside him he'd thought he'd successfully killed years ago. And every time he arrived at that garden gate, she would look up from whatever task occupied her hands and meet his eyes with an expression that said she'd been counting the days too. They talked more than anything else. Hours spent in her modest library discussing philosophy and warfare and the specific kind of damage required to survive courts built on betrayal. She understood things about power that most nobles never grasped. How it isolated. How it corrupted not through malice but through the necessity of constant vigilance. How the loneliest place in any kingdom was always the throne. Sometimes they kissed with the desperate hunger of people who'd been starving for honest connection. More often they simply sat in silence that felt more intimate than any physical contact. Two weapons learning what it meant to rest without being dismantled completely. Helena knew. Of course she knew. She was too intelligent and too observant to miss the pattern of his absences or the way he returned from those southern rides, looking simultaneously more settled and more tormented. But she never confronted him directly, just maintained their public alliance with flawless execution while creating careful distance in private moments. Their marriage remained functional, respectful, completely hollow at its core. The court whispered naturally. Servants reported his movements. Lords calculated the political implications. And somewhere in the capital, the king received detailed reports about exactly how thoroughly his strategy was working. Eleanor confronted him 6 weeks into the affair during a council meeting he'd attended in body while his mind remained 40 miles south. "You're going to destroy everything." She waited until the other advisors departed before cornering him in the war room. "Every alliance you've built, every reform you've implemented, all of it will collapse the moment the king decides your attachment to Seraphina Arden has made you controllable." Kaedric stared at the map spread across the oak table, troop movements and supply lines blurring together. "I know." "Then stop." Eleanor's voice turned sharp. "End it before it costs you the kingdom." "I can't." The admission tasted like defeat. "I've tried. God knows I've tried. But being with her is the only time I feel like something other than a weapon that learned to wield itself. And I don't know how to go back to the emptiness now that I remember what connection feels like." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying him with the expression of someone watching a valued piece slide off the board. Then you need to prepare for war. Because the king will use this against you, Caedric. And when he does, you'll have to choose between the woman who makes you feel human and the kingdom you've bled to protect. That's not romantic. That's tactical reality. What if I choose her? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Then you'll watch her die. Eleanor's voice turned cold. Because the king won't let you have both. He'll manufacture a crisis that forces your hand. A rebellion that requires you to prove loyalty by sacrificing her. An assassination attempt that positions her as the threat. Something that makes choosing her equivalent to destroying everything you've built. And when that moment comes, you'll realize too late that falling in love with your enemy's weapon was the most effective way he could have ever destroyed you. She left him alone with maps that suddenly looked like cages and the growing certainty that everything he'd tried to protect was already slipping through his fingers like blood. The messenger arrived 3 days later during the coldest rainstorm of the season. Mud-splattered and exhausted, he delivered a sealed letter directly into Caedric's hands before collapsing from exhaustion in the entrance hall. The seal was Thornwood Estate. The handwriting was Seraphina's. Caedric read it once, then again, then a third time as his world tilted sideways. The words were brief, precise, devastating. They know. The king's men are coming. If you ride here now, they'll use it as proof of conspiracy. Stay away. Please. Whatever we had was real, but it's over. Don't let me be the reason they destroy you. No signature, no flowery declarations. Just brutal honesty that cut deeper than any blade. Captain Steele found him standing in the rain outside the keep's main entrance, the letter disintegrating in his clenched fist. Your Grace, you're needed in the council chamber. There's been a development. Caedric followed in silence, water streaming from his coat, feeling the trap close around him with the inevitability of winter. The council chamber was packed. Every major lord of the Northern Territories stood in careful positions around the room, their faces arranged in expressions of neutral concern that didn't hide the calculation moving beneath. Helena stood near the windows, her posture rigid. Eleanor positioned herself near the door like she was preparing to either flee or fight. And at the head of the table sat Lord Marcus Thornfield, Helena's cousin, holding documents that Caedric recognized instantly as correspondence. His correspondence with Seraphina, private letters he'd written during sleepless nights when the isolation became unbearable. Admissions of feeling, confessions of weakness, every vulnerability he'd ever expressed, now weaponized and displayed before the people who would use them to justify his destruction. Your Grace, Marcus's voice carried across the silent room. It has come to the attention of this council that you have been conducting an inappropriate relationship with Lady Seraphina Arden, ward of the crown and daughter of a known traitor. These letters, intercepted by loyal servants concerned about your judgment, provide irrefutable evidence of conduct unbecoming a duke and potentially treasonous given Lady Seraphina's family history. Caedric stood perfectly still, his mind racing through options and finding only walls. Where did you get those? That's irrelevant. Another voice, this one belonging to Lord Edmund Veyrage, the same man who'd knelt before him months ago. What matters is that you've compromised the security of the Northern Territories by involving yourself with a woman whose loyalty to the crown is questionable at best. The king must be informed immediately. The king already knows. Helena spoke for the first time, her voice carrying steel. This entire situation was orchestrated by the crown to test my husband's loyalty and provide justification for increased royal oversight of the Northern Territories. Those letters were intercepted by agents working directly for the king's intelligence network. We're not exposing a scandal. We're participating in a carefully constructed political assassination. Silence crashed through the room like thunder. Several lords exchanged glances. Marcus's confidence flickered slightly, and Eleanor closed her eyes like someone watching a predicted disaster finally arrive. Caedric found his voice, though it sounded distant to his own ears. Helena, how long have you known? Since the beginning. She turned from the window, meeting his gaze with an expression that mixed regret and cold calculation. Did you really think I didn't notice the pattern of your absences? The way you returned from those southern rides, looking like someone who'd found something worth living for beyond pure survival? I'm not blind, Caedric, and I'm not sentimental enough to let personal feelings interfere with political necessity. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. You've been reporting to the king. I've been protecting House Thornfield. Her voice remained level. When we married, I agreed to stand beside you. But that agreement doesn't extend to watching you destroy yourself and take my family down with you. So yes, I ensured the king was kept informed of your movements. And yes, I helped facilitate the interception of correspondence that would prove your compromised judgment, because the alternative was letting you continue down a path that would have ended with Northern Territories in open rebellion and all of us dead. You sold me out to protect your position. I sold you out to save your life. Helena moved closer, her eyes hard. The king doesn't want you dead, you fool. He wants you controlled. This entire exercise was designed to demonstrate that you're not invulnerable, that you can be manipulated through emotional attachment just like any other man. Once he has proof of that weakness, he can offer you a choice. Abandon Serafina Arden publicly, execute her for espionage and conspiracy, prove your loyalty to the crown through blood sacrifice, and you retain your position. Or continue pursuing this relationship and watch the kingdom strip you of everything you've built. Caedric's hand went to his sword hilt instinctively, and every lord in the room took an involuntary step backward. Helena didn't move, just stood there watching him with the expression of someone who'd calculated this outcome months ago and accepted all possible consequences. You think I'll just execute her? His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. You think I'll prove my loyalty by killing the only person who's looked at me like I'm human instead of a weapon? I think you'll do what you've always done. Helena's voice turned almost gentle. You'll make the brutal choice required for survival. You'll bury your emotions beneath strategic necessity. And you'll hate yourself for it while telling yourself there was no alternative. That's who you are, Caedric. That's who you've had to become. The words landed like executioner's blades, each one severing another connection to the man he'd thought he might still be underneath the monster. Lord Marcus cleared his throat, reclaiming attention. The king's representative will arrive within 3 days to hear your formal response. Until then, you are confined to Blackstone Keep under house arrest. The council has voted to assume temporary governance of military operations to prevent any rash actions that might destabilize the territories. House arrest. Caedric laughed, the sound bitter and broken. You're putting me under house arrest in my own keep. We're protecting the kingdom from a compromised ruler. Edmund Verridge stepped forward, his military bearing making the words sound almost reasonable. This isn't personal, Your Grace. It's necessary. Once you've demonstrated renewed loyalty through appropriate action, authority will be restored. And if I refuse, then the king will have justification to strip your titles and redistribute the northern territories to lords he considers more reliable. Marcus's voice hardened. Your choice is simple. Execute Lady Serafina Arden for conspiracy and espionage, or lose everything you've killed to protect. Get out. Caedric's voice turned to ice. All of you. Get out before I decide house arrest is less important than decorating the walls with traitors' blood. They fled with the practiced efficiency of people who'd planned their exit routes carefully. Only Helena remained, standing in the empty council chamber like a ghost haunting the ruins of whatever they'd briefly pretended to build together. I'm sorry. Her voice was quiet. I know you won't believe me, but I genuinely am. You deserve better than this. I deserved honesty. Caedric couldn't look at her. From everyone, including myself. What will you do? He was silent for a long time, staring at maps on the walls that marked territories he'd defended with blood and sacrifice. Everything he'd built suddenly looked fragile, temporary. A structure constructed on the false assumption that control meant safety. I don't know. The admission felt like surrender. For the first time in my life, I genuinely don't know what to do. Helena moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. For what it's worth, I hope you find a way to save her, even if it costs you everything else. Because watching you become human again over these past months was the only beautiful thing that's happened in this cursed place in years. She left him alone with his thoughts, and the growing certainty that every choice available led to destruction. Eleanor found him hours later still standing in the council chamber as evening shadows consumed the light. The guards are stationed outside your chambers. You have 3 days to decide whether you're going to be the man or the monster. She poured wine with steady hands. Choose quickly. The kingdom won't wait for you to figure out who you want to be. There's a third option. Caedric finally moved, accepting the wine without drinking. I could refuse to choose at all. Force the king to make the move himself. Let him be the one who executes her while I remain neutral. That's cowardice dressed up as strategy, and you know it. Eleanor's voice turned sharp. The woman you claim to care about is sitting in that estate right now, waiting to see if the monster she helped create will choose her humanity or his throne. Don't insult her sacrifice by pretending neutrality is somehow noble. What sacrifice? Eleanor set down her glass carefully. Lady Seraphina sent you that letter warning you away, knowing the king's men were already at her gates. She chose to protect you from the consequences of loving her, even though it meant accepting whatever fate the king had planned. That's not martyrdom. That's love so honest it doesn't even expect reciprocation. And if you can't recognize that, then maybe you really are the monster everyone fears. The words settled into his chest like arrows finding their marks. What would you do? He asked quietly. If you were in my position, I'd burn the entire kingdom to the ground before letting them use someone I loved as leverage against me. Eleanor's smile was bitter. But I'm not a duke responsible for thousands of lives. I'm just an advisor who's watched too many good people get destroyed by political necessity dressed up as noble sacrifice. So my advice is worth exactly nothing. She started to leave, then turned back. One more thing, Kedrick. Whichever choice you make, own it completely. Don't half commit and tell yourself you did the best you could with impossible options. If you choose the kingdom, acknowledge you're sacrificing her to maintain your power. If you choose her, acknowledge you're willing to watch everything you built collapse to save one person. But don't pretend there's some middle path where everyone survives. That's the lie weak rulers tell themselves right before they lose everything anyway. The door closed behind her with the finality of a tomb ceiling. Kedrick spent 2 days locked in his chambers reviewing every possible strategy and finding only failures. He could rally the northern armies and challenge the king directly, but that meant civil war and thousands dead to protect his personal attachment to one woman. He could execute Seraphina as demanded and remain duke, but that meant becoming exactly the monster everyone feared while losing the only person who'd seen anything else in him. He could flee with her and abandon everything, but that meant leaving the territories vulnerable to power-hungry lords who would tear the kingdom apart within months. Every path led to destruction. Every choice required becoming someone he wasn't sure he could survive being. On the morning of the third day, the king's representative arrived with appropriate ceremony and excessive armed guard. Lord Chancellor Thomas Blackwood, a career politician who'd survived 4 different regime changes through careful neutrality and documented loyalty to whoever currently held power. He entered the great hall like a judge arriving to pronounce sentence. Kedrick stood before his father's throne, still refusing to sit, wearing formal blacks that made him look like a funeral attendee mourning his own execution. The assembled lords formed a semicircle of witnesses. Helena stood to one side, her expression carefully neutral. Eleanor positioned herself near the back, ready to flee or fight depending on how this played out. Your Grace, Blackwood's voice carried across the hall with practiced authority. I come bearing the king's judgment regarding the matter of Lady Seraphina Arden and your conduct concerning her. Deliver it. Kedrick's voice was empty. The king, in his wisdom and mercy, offers you the following terms. You will personally oversee the execution of Lady Seraphina Arden for conspiracy, espionage, and conduct designed to undermine the stability of the crown. The execution will be public, carried out in Blackstone Keep's main square, witnessed by representatives from every major house. Upon completion, you will formally renew your oaths of fealty to the crown and accept permanent royal oversight of military decisions within the Northern Territories. The words landed like stones in deep water. And if I refuse, then Lady Seraphina will be transported to the capital for trial and inevitable execution while you are stripped of all titles, lands, and authority. The Northern Territories will be redistributed among lords the king considers more reliable. You will be permitted to live out your remaining years in monastery exile, provided you swear never to engage in political or military activities again. Blackwood paused, letting the implications settle. Those are your options, Your Grace. Execute her yourself and retain your position, or refuse and watch her die anyway while losing everything you've built. The king is not without mercy, but he is also not without resolve. He expects your answer within the hour. The hall went silent enough to hear dust settling. Kedrick stared at the black throne behind him, the seat his father had occupied while slowly destroying himself through compromises and calculated betrayals. He thought about Seraphina in that garden, hands deep in earth, looking up at him with eyes that saw past the monster to something almost human. Remembered her voice saying that honesty was more dangerous than any political threat because it made you care whether the person survived. She'd been right about everything. And now he had to choose between being the weapon the kingdom needed or the man she'd helped him remember he could be. I need to see her. The words came out steady despite everything fracturing inside. Before I give my answer, I need to see her one last time. Blackwood frowned. That's irregular. I don't care about regular. Cadrick's voice turned to iron. You're asking me to execute someone I care about to prove my loyalty. The least you can do is grant me the courtesy of a final conversation. Unless the king's mercy is so limited, it can't accommodate one honest moment before requiring brutality. The challenge hung in the air like drawn steel. Blackwood calculated for a moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. You have 2 hours. Guards will accompany you to ensure no attempts at escape or rescue. But you may speak with her privately before delivering your decision. Cadrick descended from the dais without responding, moving through the assembled lords with the mechanical precision of someone who'd stopped feeling anything except the weight of impossible choices. The ride to Thornwood took 40 minutes that felt like crossing into another world. The estate looked different under gray skies with armed guards surrounding it, less like refuge and more like the prison it had always been. They brought Serafina to the same garden where he'd first kissed her 3 months ago. She wore simple clothes, her hair loose, no jewelry or symbols of status. Just a woman who'd survived everything except the mistake of making a monster remember his humanity. She smiled when she saw him, and it broke something inside his chest that he thought was already shattered beyond repair. You came. I had to. He waited until the guards withdrew to the gates before moving closer. Serafina, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. All of it. She shook her head, reaching up to touch his face with hands that trembled slightly. Don't. Don't take responsibility for choices I made freely. I knew what I was risking the first moment I looked at you and decided honesty was worth the danger. No one forced me to care about the monster everyone fears. I chose it. The king is making me execute you. The words came out broken. He's offering me a choice that isn't really a choice at all. Kill you and keep my position, or refuse and watch you die anyway while losing everything. Serafina was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on his jaw. Then you should do it. What? You should execute me yourself. Her voice remained steady despite the impossible things she was saying. Because if you refuse, I die either way and you lose the ability to protect the Northern Territories. At least this way, one of us survives with the power to maybe make something good out of all this destruction. I can't. His throat constricted around the words. I can't kill you, Serafina. You're the only person who's ever looked at me like I'm something other than a weapon that learned to walk upright. Then remember me that way. Her smile turned sad. Remember that for a few months you were human with me. You laughed. You talked about philosophy instead of military strategy. You let yourself be vulnerable without immediately calculating how it could be used against you. That's not nothing, Cadrick. That's everything most people never get to experience even once. Tears he didn't know he was still capable of producing burned in his eyes. There has to be another way. There isn't. She pulled him closer, her forehead resting against his. The king has made sure of that. He's backed you into a position where every choice available requires becoming someone you'll hate. That's the real execution here, not me, you. He's killing the man you were becoming by forcing you to choose the monster you've always been. Then I'll choose you. The words came out desperate. I'll abandon the throne. We'll flee together. The kingdom can burn for all I care. And sentence how many thousands to death in the civil war that follows? Serafina's voice turned fierce. Don't insult what we had by pretending love justifies that level of destruction. You became a monster to protect people, Cadrick. Don't stop being that monster now just because it costs you personally. That would make every brutal thing you've done meaningless. The garden seemed to shrink until the world consisted only of 2 people trying to figure out how to say goodbye to something that should have saved them, but ended up being the weapon that destroyed them both. I love you. He said it finally. The admission he'd been too afraid to voice because love meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death. I don't know when it happened or how to stop it, but I love you in a way that makes every strategic calculation meaningless. I know. Serafina kissed him one last time, and it tasted like salt and endings. I love you too. That's why I'm asking you to let me go. Not because I want to die, but because I'd rather die knowing you stayed human enough to grieve me than survive watching you become completely empty again. They held each other in silence until the guards returned to announce time was up. Walking away from her was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Harder than killing his father. Harder than executing 86 conspirators. Harder than every brutal choice he'd made in the name of survival. Because this time, he wasn't choosing to survive. He was choosing to remain the monster the kingdom needed while burying the man she'd helped him remember he could be. The ride back to Blackstone Keep passed in silence. When he entered the great hall where Lord Blackwood waited with the assembled court, Kedrick's expression revealed nothing of the devastation moving beneath. "Your answer, Your Grace?" He stood before them all, these nobles who'd watched him transform from an angry boy into the most dangerous man in the kingdom. Looked at Helena, who'd sold him out to protect her family. At Eleanor, who'd warned him this moment was coming. At the throne behind him that demanded sacrifices he wasn't sure he could keep making. Then he spoke the words that would define him forever as either the kingdom's greatest protector or its most brutal tyrant. "Prepare the scaffold in the main square. The execution will take place at dawn tomorrow. I will personally carry out the king's justice and demonstrate my loyalty to the crown through the appropriate sacrifice." Blackwood nodded with satisfaction. "A wise choice, Your Grace. The king will be pleased by your decisive action and renewed commitment to stability." But Kedrick wasn't finished speaking. However, his voice dropped to something cold enough to freeze blood. "After the execution is complete and my loyalty proven beyond question, I want it clearly documented that I carried out this order under explicit coercion. The king manufactured this crisis specifically to demonstrate his control over the northern territories. He used an innocent woman as leverage to force my compliance. And while I will obey because I have no choice that doesn't result in greater destruction, I want the record to show exactly what kind of loyalty he's purchased." The hall went silent. Furthermore, he continued, his voice gaining strength. "Going forward, the Northern Territories will comply with all royal oversight and military restrictions. But the lords of this court should understand clearly that we now serve a crown willing to destroy its own subjects to maintain dominance. Remember that when you're asked to make similar sacrifices in the name of political necessity. That borders on treason, Your Grace." Blackwood's voice turned sharp. "No." Kedrick's smile was bitter. "Treason would be refusing the order. I'm simply ensuring everyone understands the truth beneath the politics. The king wanted me broken and controlled. He's achieved that, but he hasn't earned respect or genuine loyalty. Only obedience purchased through brutal coercion. There's a difference." He turned to leave the hall, then paused. "One final thing, Lord Chancellor. Tell your king that the monster he's created today will serve him faithfully, will carry out his orders without question, will defend the realm with ruthless efficiency for as long as required, but also tell him that monsters don't forget, and they don't forgive. Eventually, every weapon turned against its own purpose finds a new target. The threat hung in the air like smoke from an execution pyre not yet lit." Kedrick walked from the hall into the night, leaving behind a court that had just witnessed a man choose between his humanity and his duty, then watched both die together in the space between impossible options. He spent that night alone in his chambers, staring at the scaffold being constructed in the main square below. Wood and rope, and the systematic preparation for judicial murder dressed up as political necessity. By dawn, it would be ready. By noon, Serafina would be dead by his own hand, and whatever remained of Duke Kedrick Ravenscar after that moment would be something new, something more dangerous than the monster he'd been before, because now he understood exactly what the throne cost, and he'd paid the price in full. Eleanor found him just before sunrise, standing at the window watching dawn break across a kingdom that demanded everything and offered nothing except survival. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do." His voice was empty. "This is what ruling looks like when you strip away all the comfortable lies. Sacrificing people you love to maintain systems that will eventually destroy you too. My father learned that lesson too late. At least I'm learning it while I still have the strength to survive it." She left without responding because there was nothing left to say. At dawn, Duke Kedrick Ravenscar stood in the main square before the assembled court and carried out the execution of Lady Serafina Arden with the brutal efficiency of a man who'd finally become exactly what survival demanded. She died meeting his eyes with forgiveness he didn't deserve and love that would haunt him until his own death claimed him. The kingdom called it justice. History would call it necessary. But standing there with her blood on his hands and his humanity lying dead at his feet Caedric Ravenscar understood one final truth that no amount of strategic calculation or ruthless pragmatism could change. He had saved the kingdom by destroying the only part of himself worth saving, and now he would rule forever as the monster they needed, with nothing left inside except the memory of 3 months when someone had looked at him like he was human and made him believe it might be true. The scaffold stood in the square for 3 days after, a reminder of what happened when dukes remembered they were men instead of weapons. Then it was dismantled and the kingdom moved forward. Because kingdoms always did, even when the people who defended them were already dead inside. The scaffold came down on the 3rd day, but the bloodstain remained in the main square for weeks, a dark mark against the cobblestones that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Servants stopped trying after the first week. The stain became part of Blackstone Keep's architecture, a permanent reminder of what loyalty to the crown actually cost when you stripped away all the comfortable lies about honor and duty. Caedric watched it from his chamber window every morning, forcing himself to look at the evidence of what he'd become. The king's representative had departed the day after the execution with appropriate gratitude and thinly veiled satisfaction. The northern lords returned to their estates with the understanding that their duke was now fully broken and controlled. Helena maintained her position as duchess, navigating court politics with flawless execution while avoiding him whenever possible. Even she couldn't quite meet his eyes anymore. He ruled with mechanical efficiency for 6 months, carrying out every order and defending every border with the ruthless precision the kingdom demanded. But something fundamental had shifted inside him the moment Seraphina's blood touched his hands. He'd crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed, and on the other side of that line existed a version of himself that frightened even the people who'd spent years watching him kill without hesitation. Because the monster they'd created before still had something to protect: purpose, direction, the belief that brutal choices served some greater stability. Now he had nothing except the memory of 3 months when he'd almost been human, and the absolute certainty that every system built on such sacrifices deserved to burn. Eleanor noticed first because Eleanor always noticed. She found him in the war room late one night, surrounded by maps that weren't defensive strategies but invasion plans. Routes into the capital, weak points in the king's military structure, supply lines that could be severed to create chaos. "What are you doing?" Her voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Caedric didn't look up from the document spread across the oak table. Learning, calculating, planning for contingencies that might become necessary. That's treason. Eleanor crossed to the table, her eyes scanning the detailed notes with growing alarm. Those are attack plans against the crown itself. If anyone sees this, no one will see it except us. He finally met her gaze, and whatever she saw there made her take an involuntary step backward. I'm not stupid enough to leave evidence lying around, but I'm also not willing to continue serving a king who manufactures crises to break his own defenders. Eventually, every weapon realizes it's being used against its own interests. I'm just preparing for when that realization becomes action. You're talking about civil war. Her voice dropped to a whisper. About destroying everything you've built. I'm talking about refusing to be controlled through atrocities disguised as political necessity. Caedric straightened, his expression empty of anything except cold calculation. The king wanted me broken, obedient, a loyal weapon that would carry out any order without question. He achieved that through Seraphina. But he failed to consider what happens when you break someone so completely they stop caring about consequences. So what? You're going to march on the capital? Challenge the king directly? Get yourself and everyone who follows you killed in some suicidal gesture of revenge? Maybe. He moved to the window, staring out at the blood-stained square below. Or maybe I'm just tired of pretending this system is worth defending. That stability built on forcing good people to execute those they love is somehow noble. That any kingdom requiring such sacrifices deserves the loyalty it demands. Eleanor was silent for a long moment, studying him with the expression of someone trying to decide whether she was witnessing genius or madness. Then you're planning to destroy the monarchy itself. It wasn't a question. I'm planning to give the king a very simple choice. Caedric's voice turned to ice. He can release control over the northern territories and allow us genuine autonomy, or he can watch me systematically dismantle every power structure that allows him to terrorize his own defenders into obedience. I'm done being his weapon. If he wants the North defended, he'll negotiate with me as an equal rather than commanding me like a slave. That's suicide. The king will never agree to those terms. He'll mobilize every southern army and crush you before you can organize effective resistance. Probably. Kadric smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Eleanor had ever seen. But I'll burn enough of his kingdom on the way down that whoever inherits the throne will think twice before using similar tactics. Sometimes the point isn't winning, it's making the cost of victory so high that nobody wants to pay it again. Eleanor sank into a chair, her usual composure cracking. You've gone insane. Grief has broken you so completely, you're willing to destroy everyone and everything in some pointless gesture of defiance. Not pointless. He turned to face her fully. Every person who serves a tyrant tells themselves they have no choice. That resistance means death. So compliance is the only rational option. But as long as that remains true, nothing ever changes. Someone has to demonstrate that choosing death with dignity is preferable to living as a controlled weapon. Maybe I'm that someone. And all the people who'll die in the war you're planning? Do they get a say in your noble suicide? They've been dying for years to maintain systems that sacrifice the vulnerable to protect the powerful. At least this way they'll die for the possibility of something different. Kadric's expression hardened. I'm not asking you to support this, Eleanor. I'm telling you what's coming so you can position yourself accordingly. When I move against the king, you'll need to choose which side you're on. I'm on the side of not watching everyone I care about get slaughtered in a civil war that accomplishes nothing except making you feel better about becoming a martyr. Then you should probably leave Blackstone Keep soon. He returned to the maps, dismissing her. Because this place is going to become the center of a conflict that ends with either genuine autonomy for the Northern Territories or my head decorating the Capitol gates. Either way, it won't be safe for neutral observers. Eleanor stood slowly, her expression mixing fear and something that might have been admiration if she wasn't too horrified to acknowledge it. You loved her that much? Enough to burn the entire kingdom? No. Kadric's voice turned quiet. I love her so little that I'm willing to burn the kingdom just to hurt the people who forced me to kill her. That's the difference between noble sacrifice and bitter revenge. I'm not trying to honor her memory. I'm trying to make everyone who benefited from her death wish they'd made a different choice. That's monstrous. Yes. He met her eyes one final time. It is. Welcome to the logical conclusion of your own advice, Eleanor. You told me to own my choices completely, to acknowledge what I was sacrificing and why. Well, I sacrificed my humanity to maintain a system built on terror and coercion. Now I'm going to burn that system to the ground because monsters don't owe loyalty to anyone except their own rage. She left without responding because there was nothing left to say. The rebellion began 3 weeks later in the smallest possible way. A single lord refusing to pay increased taxes the king had levied to fund expansion of royal military forces. Lord Henrik Ashwood, a minor noble with barely 300 soldiers under his command, publicly declared that the Northern Territories would no longer finance military operations designed to increase crown control over autonomous regions. The king's response was predictable. Immediate arrest ordered, assets seized, public trial scheduled in the capital with execution as the predetermined outcome. Kadric received word of the situation while reviewing defensive positions along the eastern border. Captain Steele delivered the message personally, his expression carefully neutral despite obvious awareness that how the Duke responded would determine whether the North remained stable or exploded into open conflict. Lord Ashwood is requesting asylum at Blackstone Keep. He's fleeing the king's forces with whatever troops remained loyal after the seizure order. They'll arrive within 2 days if you grant protection. And if I grant that protection, Kadric asked quietly, then the king has justification to accuse you of harboring fugitives and supporting rebellion. It would give him the opening he needs to move against the Northern Territories directly. Steele hesitated, then continued, but if you refuse asylum and allow Ashwood to be captured, every minor lord in the North will understand that you'll sacrifice them to maintain your own position. They'll stop trusting you to defend them against royal overreach. Either way, you're making a choice that defines what kind of ruler you actually are. Kadric stared at the military report spread across his desk, seeing paths branch into futures that all led toward violence. The strategic choice was obvious. Refuse asylum, maintain stability, let Ashwood become another sacrifice on the altar of political necessity. But he'd already made that choice once with Serafina, and the cost had left him hollow enough that strategic calculation no longer carried the same weight. Grant him asylum. His voice was steady. Station Ashwood and his forces in the western barracks. Inform the king's representative that the Northern Territories are exercising their historical right to provide refuge for lords fleeing unjust persecution, and prepare our armies for siege. The king will respond within a week. Captain Steele's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, an almost imperceptible straightening. Your Grace, you understand this means war. Yes. Kedrick stood, moving to the window overlooking valleys he'd defended for years with blood and ruthless pragmatism. It means war. But it also means I'm finally done pretending that obedience purchased through atrocity is somehow noble. Let the king come. We'll show him what happens when you create monsters and then act surprised when they stop following commands. Word spread through the Northern Territories within days. Duke Ravenscar had granted asylum to a fugitive lord. The king's forces were mobilizing. War was coming regardless of what anyone wanted. And in the chaos of preparing defenses and repositioning troops, something remarkable happened. Lords who'd spent months watching Kaedric operate as a broken weapon suddenly saw something different. A man choosing principle over survival, risking everything to defend someone weaker from a system that sacrificed the vulnerable to maintain control. It resonated in ways his previous brutality never had. Within 2 weeks, 12 additional houses declared support for Blackstone's position. Not open rebellion yet, but clear statements that the Northern Territories would defend their own against unjust royal persecution. The king's attempts to isolate and punish Ashwood had instead unified disparate nobles who'd never agreed on anything except that being terrorized into submission was unsustainable. Eleanor returned during the 3rd week, riding through the gates with minimal escort and an expression that mixed resignation and determination. I thought you were leaving. Kaedric met her in the courtyard as servants scrambled to accommodate the unexpected arrival. I tried. Eleanor dismounted with careful precision, got as far as the southern border before realizing I'd rather die fighting for something than survive by abandoning everyone I care about. You were right about one thing. Someone needs to demonstrate that resistance is possible even when success seems impossible. Might as well be us. You'll die here. The words weren't a threat, just acknowledgement of probable outcomes. Probably, she smiled grimly, but at least I'll die for something other than maintaining systems built on forcing good people to execute those they love. That's worth something. Kaedric studied her for a moment, seeing reflected in her face the same exhausted determination that drove him now. The absolute certainty that continuing to serve a corrupt system was worse than dying to resist it. Welcome back. He turned toward the keep's entrance. We're planning defensive strategies in the war room. Your input would be valuable. The king's army arrived exactly 3 weeks after Ashwood received asylum. 20,000 soldiers, including elite Royal Guard units and conscripted forces from southern territories that had no interest in northern politics but lacked the power to refuse mobilization orders. They surrounded Blackstone Keep's positions with methodical efficiency, cutting off supply routes and establishing siege camps designed for extended occupation. Lord Chancellor Blackwood rode to the gates under white flag, accompanied by a dozen armored guards and an expression that suggested he found this entire situation personally offensive. Kedrick met him on the walls, refusing to grant the courtesy of private audience. Whatever the king's representative had to say could be delivered publicly, where every defender could hear. Your Grace! Blackwood's voice carried across the stone battlements. The king offers final terms. Surrender Lord Ashwood immediately. Submit to royal authority. Accept permanent military occupation of Blackstone Keep, and you will be permitted to retain your title and lands under direct crown supervision. And if I refuse, then your rebellion will be crushed with appropriate force. The Northern Territories will be reorganized under new governance, and you will be executed for treason alongside everyone who followed you into this pointless defiance. Kaedric leaned against the battlements, looking down at the representative with an expression of absolute calm. Tell your king something for me, Chancellor. Tell him that Duke Kaedric Ravenscar died 6 months ago when he executed an innocent woman to prove loyalty to a crown that demands atrocities as tribute. What's left is just the monster he created. And monsters don't negotiate. They burn. He gestured toward the surrounding army. Your king brought 20,000 soldiers to force submission. I'm looking at them right now, and I see something different. I see 20,000 people who were conscripted or coerced or threatened into fighting a war they have no stake in. Men who'd rather be home protecting their families instead of dying to enforce royal dominance over territories that want nothing except to be left alone. Where are you going with this? Blackwood's voice turned sharp. I'm saying that before this siege ends, many of those soldiers will be dead. And for what? To prove that the king can terrorize his own defenders into obedience? To demonstrate that refusing unjust orders means execution? Every person who dies in this siege will die protecting a system built on fear and coercion instead of genuine loyalty. That's a bold speech from a man about to be crushed by overwhelming force. Maybe. Kadrick's smile turned cold. Or maybe I'm the first person crazy enough to demonstrate that death with dignity beats living as a controlled weapon. Either way, the king won't enjoy his victory. I'll make sure of that. He turned to leave, then paused. One more thing, Chancellor. The scaffold where I executed Serafina Arden still stains the main square below us. That blood won't wash out no matter how many times servants scrub. Tell your king that I plan to add his to it before this ends. Not a threat, a promise. He wanted a monster. Now he gets to learn what monsters do when they stop caring about survival. Blackwood withdrew without responding, and the siege began in earnest. The first week was probing attacks, testing defenses, measuring response times. Kadrick's forces held with brutal efficiency, turning every attempted breach into a killing field that left royal soldiers piled against the walls like cordwood. The defenders fought with the desperate intensity of people who understood surrender meant execution, regardless of promises made under white flags. The second week brought heavier assaults, siege towers, battering rams, sustained bombardment of the outer fortifications. Stone cracked under relentless pressure. Defenders died holding positions that couldn't be reinforced, and still Blackstone held because retreating accomplished nothing except dying slower. By the third week, both sides had bled enough that the siege took on qualities of nightmare. Bodies rotted in no man's land between the walls and siege camps. Disease spread through cramped quarters. Supplies dwindled toward critical levels. And every morning, Kadrick stood on the battlements watching the king's forces prepare another assault while calculating how many more days they could hold before starvation accomplished what military force couldn't. Helena found him there on the morning of the 22nd day, her formal court attire abandoned for practical clothes that allowed easier movement through the keep's damaged sections. They're preparing for a major assault. She stood beside him, staring at the siege preparations below. Final push. They'll hit us from 3 directions simultaneously. Captain Steele estimates we have maybe 40% chance of holding all 3 breach points. Kadrick nodded slowly, his expression unchanged. Then we'll die defending them. Better than surrendering and watching everyone get executed anyway. Is that what you want? Her voice turned sharp. Death as some grand gesture of defiance? You've turned this entire siege into a suicide mission because you can't accept that sometimes survival requires compromise. I compromised 6 months ago. He finally looked at her, and whatever she saw in his eyes made her flinch. I executed someone I loved to prove loyalty to a system that demands atrocities as tribute. And you know what I learned? That compromise doesn't buy safety. It just proves you're controllable. So yes, I'd rather die fighting than spend the rest of my life waiting to see what the king forces me to destroy next. You're insane. Probably. He turned back to the siege preparations below. But at least I'm honestly insane instead of pretending that obeying tyrants is somehow rational. She left without responding, and Kadrick remained on the battlements alone, watching dawn break across a battlefield that would likely see his death before sunset. The assault began at noon with a bombardment so intense the entire keep shook like an earthquake was trying to tear it from the mountain. Stone exploded into shrapnel that cut through defenders like scythes through wheat. The eastern wall collapsed in sections, opening breach points that royal forces poured through with the momentum of a flood breaking through a dam. Kadrick fought in the thick of it, abandoning all pretense of commanding from a safe distance. His sword cut through enemy soldiers with mechanical precision, while his mind cataloged everything falling apart. The western barracks burning, the northern tower collapsing. Defenders dying faster than reinforcements could plug the gaps. They were losing, not slowly, not with dignity, just losing with the brutal efficiency of overwhelming force applied against inadequate resistance. Captain Steele found him in the courtyard where the bloodstain from Serafina's execution had expanded to cover half the square with fresh casualties. Your Grace, we need to evacuate. The keep is falling. If we don't retreat through the northern passages now, we'll be trapped. No. Kadrick blocked an incoming strike, his blade punching through armor into flesh beneath. No retreat. We hold until we can't hold anymore. And when that moment comes, We make sure the king pays for every inch in blood. That's suicide. That's the point. He kicked the dying soldier away, already moving to the next attacker. Every defender who dies here is another piece of evidence that the king's authority rests on nothing except his willingness to slaughter his own people. Let history record what stability actually costs when you strip away all the comfortable lies. Eleanor appeared through the chaos, her formal robes torn and blood-stained, a borrowed sword in her hands that she clearly barely knew how to use. The eastern section is lost. We're being overrun on all sides. I need to hold this square. His voice cut through the sounds of battle like thunder. This is where I killed her, where I proved loyalty by destroying the only thing worth protecting. If I die anywhere, it's here. At least then the blood will finally match the crime. That's not honor. That's just guilt dressed up as sacrifice. She was right. They both knew it. But guilt and honor looked identical when viewed through the lens of someone who'd already decided death beat living with what he'd become. The royal forces broke through the final defensive line an hour before sunset, came pouring into the main square like water finally overwhelming a failing dam. Caedric's remaining defenders formed a desperate circle around him, maybe 50 soldiers still standing against hundreds closing in from all directions. Lord Chancellor Blackwood rode into the square on horseback, surveying the carnage with an expression of grim satisfaction. Surrender, Your Grace. This is your final opportunity. Lay down your weapons and submit to royal authority. Caedric stood in the center of the blood-stained square, sword still dripping, surrounded by the corpses of people who'd believed his defiance meant something. His body ached from the dozen wounds that would prove fatal if they weren't treated soon. His vision blurred from blood loss and exhaustion, but his voice came out steady. Come take my surrender, Chancellor. Come into this square where I executed an innocent woman to prove loyalty your king didn't deserve. Come stand where her blood mixed with the blood of everyone else sacrificed to maintain your comfortable stability. Then look me in the eye and tell me that the system you're defending is worth the corpses required to sustain it. Blackwood hesitated, and in that hesitation, something shifted. A horn sounded from beyond the walls. Not the king's forces. Something else. A different call that made royal soldiers turn in confusion toward the northern approaches. Then the gates exploded inward, not from siege weapons, from inside. Servants who'd spent months watching their duke transform from controlled weapon to honest rebel finally making their choice. They'd opened the northern entrances to let in reinforcements that shouldn't exist, but impossible things kept happening. Through the shattered gates poured soldiers wearing colors Caedric didn't immediately recognize. Then he saw the banners. 12 different noble houses. The lords who'd declared support weeks ago, now arriving with whatever forces they could muster. Maybe 3,000 troops total against the king's remaining 15,000, still hopelessly outnumbered, but no longer alone. Lord Henrik Ashwood, the minor noble whose asylum had sparked this entire conflict, rode at the front of the relief force. His armor was battered and his forces looked exhausted from forced march through mountain passes, but his voice carried across the square with absolute clarity. Duke Ravenscar, the Northern Territories stand with you. Not because we're rebels, because we're tired of being terrorized into obedience by a king who treats loyalty like something purchased through atrocity. The royal forces hesitated, suddenly facing not just a failing keep, but reinforcements willing to die for principle instead of following orders. And in that moment of confusion, Caedric understood what he'd actually accomplished. Not military victory, not successful rebellion, but demonstration that resistance was possible even when success seemed impossible. That choosing death with dignity inspired others to make similar choices. That sometimes the point wasn't winning. It was refusing to accept that losing was inevitable. He raised his sword, blood streaming down his arm, his voice somehow carrying across the entire square despite exhaustion that threatened to drop him where he stood. The king wanted obedience. He wanted weapons that would carry out any order without question. He manufactured crises and forced brutal choices to prove his control was absolute. He gestured at the carnage surrounding them. Look at the cost of that control. Look at the bodies piled in this square. Every person who died here died protecting a system that demands we sacrifice everything we love to maintain someone else's power. Is this the kingdom worth defending? Is this the stability worth bleeding for? His gaze locked onto Lord Chancellor Blackwood. Tell your king something for me, Chancellor. Tell him the monster he created just taught the entire North that death beats submission. That every person who watched this siege understands now that the choice isn't between loyalty and rebellion, It's between living as controlled weapons or dying as free people. The northern reinforcements roared approval, 3,000 voices unified in defiance that shouldn't be possible, but somehow was. And the royal forces, conscripted and coerced and threatened into fighting this war, began to waver, began to question whether crushing this rebellion was worth dying to enforce a king's dominance over territories that wanted nothing except autonomy. Blackwood's horse reared as the situation spiraled beyond his control. "This isn't over, Ravenscar. The king will send more forces. This rebellion will be crushed." "Maybe." Cedric's smile was bitter. But he'll never again be able to pretend that loyalty freely given and obedience purchased through terror are the same thing. Every kingdom that watched this siege understands now what stability actually costs. Some of them might decide it's too expensive. He collapsed then, blood loss and exhaustion finally claiming what enemy swords couldn't. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Eleanor's face above his, her expression mixing horror and something that looked almost like pride. "You insane fool!" Her voice seemed to come from very far away. "You actually did it. You made them believe resistance was possible." Then consciousness abandoned him completely, and Duke Cedric Ravenscar fell into darkness, not knowing whether he'd survive to see what happened next or whether his death would become the final piece of evidence that sometimes choosing principle over survival inspired others to make similar choices. The battle continued around his fallen form, as northern reinforcements clashed with royal forces in a courtyard soaked with enough blood to drown kingdoms. And far to the south in the capital, King Aldrich received word of the siege's outcome with an expression that promised consequences no one could predict. Because the duke they'd called monster had just demonstrated something far more dangerous than military might or ruthless pragmatism. He'd proven that even broken weapons could inspire rebellion when they finally decided that death beat submission. And that lesson, once learned, couldn't be unlearned no matter how many armies the king mobilized to crush it. Cedric woke to pain so absolute it took several minutes to remember why being alive mattered enough to endure it. Every breath felt like knives grinding between his ribs. His left arm hung useless, the shoulder wound deep enough that infection seemed inevitable. And when he finally forced his eyes open, the first thing he saw was Eleanor's exhausted face, hovering above him like a ghost keeping vigil over the dying. "You're awake." Her voice carried relief and something darker. "Good. We need you functional enough to witness what you started." "Where am I?" The words scraped out of his throat like gravel. "The keep's inner sanctum." "We held the square long enough to retreat into the deep fortifications. The royal forces pulled back after nightfall to regroup." She helped him sit up despite his body's violent protests. "You've been unconscious for 2 days. A lot has changed." Cedric focused through the pain, cataloging his surroundings. The sanctum was a reinforced chamber carved deep into the mountain beneath Blackstone Keep, designed for exactly this kind of siege. Stone walls thick enough to withstand bombardment. Limited access points that could be defended by minimal forces. And scattered throughout the space, maybe 300 defenders who looked as damaged as he felt. "How many did we lose?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know. 1,700 dead. Another 400 wounded badly enough they won't fight again. Eleanor's expression remained neutral despite the numbers. But the northern reinforcements brought our total defending force to around 4,000. And the king's army pulled back to reassess after losing nearly 6,000 in the final assault. 6,000. The number settled into his chest like a stone. All those people dead because I refused to submit. All those people dead because the king chose to enforce dominance through slaughter. Eleanor's voice turned sharp. "Don't take responsibility for choices that started long before you granted asylum to one minor lord. This conflict has been building for years. You just had the courage to finally name it honestly. Courage or insanity. Sometimes I can't tell the difference anymore. Maybe there isn't one." She moved to the chamber entrance, looking out at defenders who sat in small groups tending wounds and sharing what little food remained. When you have nothing left to lose, courage and insanity look identical from the outside. The only difference is whether you survive long enough to justify it as one or the other. Captain Steele approached through the gloom, his armor dented and blood-stained, but his bearing still military precise despite obvious exhaustion. "Your Grace." He saluted formally. "Lord Chancellor Blackwood is requesting parley under white flag. He says the king is willing to negotiate terms." Cedric laughed, the sound bitter and broken. "Negotiate? After 6,000 dead, now he wants to negotiate. What changed? Steele's expression remained carefully neutral. Word of the siege has spread to other territories. 3 more northern houses have declared support for your position. More significantly, 2 eastern provinces have sent envoys questioning whether the king's authority extends to crushing legitimate regional autonomy through military force. The conflict is spreading beyond what he anticipated. So he didn't break me fast enough, and now he's worried about losing control of other territories. Kedrick pushed himself to standing despite his body screaming protests. Where does he want to meet? The main square, where the bloodstain is. Steele paused. He specifically requested that location. I think he wants to remind you what submission cost before. Then he's forgotten that I stopped caring about survival the moment her blood touched my hands. Kedrick moved toward the entrance with mechanical determination. Tell Blackwood I'll meet him at noon, and prepare whatever forces we have left. If this is a trap, we'll make our final stand above ground, instead of suffocating in these caves. Your Grace, you can barely walk. Eleanor's concern was genuine. At least let the healers finish. No. He cut her off. The king's representative wants to negotiate in the place where I proved loyalty through atrocity. Fine. Let him see what that loyalty bought him. Let him stand in blood that won't wash clean and explain why I should ever trust royal promises again. The climb from the sanctum to the main square took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Every step sent fresh waves of agony through his damaged body, but Kedrick forced himself to move without assistance. The defenders needed to see their duke walking on his own strength, even if that strength was more stubbornness than actual capability. The square looked apocalyptic in daylight. Bodies had been cleared, but blood soaked the cobblestones so thoroughly the entire space appeared rust-colored. Sections of the keep's walls had collapsed into rubble. Smoke still rose from burning structures. And through it all, the original stain from Serafina's execution remained visible, darker than the surrounding carnage, like a wound that wouldn't heal. Lord Chancellor Blackwood waited in the center of the square with a dozen guards and an expression that mixed exhaustion with calculation. He looked older than when the siege began, like he'd aged years and weeks watching theoretical political maneuvers transform into actual mass casualties. Your Grace, his voice carried across the devastated space. Thank you for agreeing to meet. The king has reviewed the situation and wishes to propose revised terms. Revised. Kedrick stopped at the edge of the original bloodstain, forcing Blackwood to approach him rather than meeting halfway. Tell me, Chancellor, what revision could possibly matter after 6,000 corpses? What terms make that level of slaughter somehow acceptable? The king acknowledges that the situation escalated beyond initial projections. Blackwood's diplomatic training held despite obvious discomfort. He's prepared to offer significant concessions in exchange for your renewed loyalty and cooperation in stabilizing the northern territories. Defined significant. Blackwood pulled a sealed document from his coat, the royal seal evident even from a distance. Full autonomy for the northern territories in domestic matters. Reduced taxation to levels that allow genuine self-governance. Withdrawal of royal military forces from permanent occupation positions. And formal recognition that regional lords maintain authority over local decisions without requiring crown approval for non-military matters. The terms were everything Kedrick had demanded before the siege, everything he'd been willing to die for when submission seemed worse than death. And in exchange, he asked quietly, you publicly reaffirm loyalty to the crown. You acknowledge that the siege was a regrettable misunderstanding rather than justified rebellion. And you accept appointment as the king's official representative for all northern territories, with authority to negotiate directly with the crown on regional matters. Kedrick studied the document without taking it, his mind processing implications that went far beyond the written terms. So the king gets to save face by calling this a misunderstanding instead of admitting he terrorized his own defenders into rebellion. I get autonomy purchased with 6,000 lives, and we all pretend the system that created this disaster is somehow fixed. The alternative is the siege continues until everyone dies and the king reorganizes the north under lords who will enforce his will without question. Blackwood's voice remained level. These terms give you what you fought for, Your Grace. Genuine autonomy, real power to protect your people from future overreach. Isn't that worth accepting? Eleanor had positioned herself close enough to hear the exchange. She caught Kedrick's eye with an expression that mixed hope and warning. This was the victory they'd bled for. Imperfect, compromised, but real nonetheless. I need to consult with my advisors. Cadric turned away from Blackwood, moving toward where Eleanor stood. "Give me 1 hour." They gathered in what remained of the war room, maybe 20 people who'd survived to see whether their sacrifice meant anything beyond adding to the body count. Lords who'd brought reinforcements. Captains who'd held impossible positions. Eleanor with her strategic mind. Even Helena appeared, her formal composure cracked but not completely shattered. "He wants us to call it a misunderstanding." Kedrick laid out the terms with brutal honesty. "Wants me to pretend that 6,000 people died because of miscommunication rather than systematic abuse of power. In exchange, we get genuine autonomy and the authority to prevent this from happening again. That's victory." Lord Ashwood spoke first, his voice rough from smoke inhalation and exhaustion. "Not the clean victory we'd prefer, but victory nonetheless. We fought to prove resistance was possible. These terms prove we were right. We fought because I refused to execute one more innocent person to satisfy a king's need for control." Kedrick's voice turned cold. "Don't dress it up as some noble cause. I started this war because I'd rather die than continue being a weapon that kills on command. And now you've demonstrated that weapons can refuse orders." Helena's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "The king is offering these terms because other territories watched this siege and started questioning their own submission. You didn't just fight for the North. You gave everyone else permission to consider resistance as an option. At what cost?" He gestured toward the devastated square beyond the walls. 6,000 dead, thousands more injured, entire families destroyed, infrastructure ruined. And for what? So I can feel better about refusing to kill on command? So the next duke who faces a similar choice knows there's an alternative to submission. Eleanor moved closer, her voice intense. "You're so focused on the bodies you can't see what you actually accomplished. Before this siege, every lord in the kingdom believed obedience was the only rational choice. Now they know resistance is possible even against overwhelming force. That's worth the cost, Cadric, not because the dead don't matter, but because their sacrifice might prevent future generations from having to make similar choices." The room fell silent as everyone processed what accepting these terms would mean. Not just autonomy for the North, but precedent that could reshape how the entire kingdom functioned. "If I accept," Kedrick spoke slowly, thinking through implications. "If I take these terms and call it victory, I'm legitimizing everything that came before. The execution, the siege. All of it becomes justified by the outcome. Or you acknowledge that sometimes progress requires paying prices we wish we didn't have to pay." Eleanor's voice gentled. "You can spend the rest of your life torturing yourself over the cost, or you can make their sacrifice mean something by building a system where future rulers don't have to choose between submission and slaughter. And if I refuse, if I continue fighting until the king crushes us completely, then you die feeling morally pure while accomplishing nothing except adding to the body count." Helena's voice carried steel. "I betrayed you, Cadric. I helped the king manufacture the crisis that led to Seraphina's death. I own that. But I'm telling you now that accepting these terms is the only choice that justifies what we've all endured." "Why?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Why do you care whether I justify it?" "Because I have to live with what I did." Her composure finally cracked, revealing raw pain beneath. "I have to wake every day knowing I facilitated the death of someone you loved to protect my family's position. If your sacrifice and hers leads to genuine change, then maybe I can eventually forgive myself. But if you throw away everything we fought for because you can't accept imperfect victory, then all that death means nothing, and I'm just a traitor who helped destroy a good man for temporary stability." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Kedrick looked around the room at faces that reflected various degrees of damage and determination. These people had followed him into a war that should have killed them all, had believed his defiance meant something worth dying for, and now they waited to see whether he'd take the victory they'd bled to achieve or continue pursuing death with dignity instead of life with compromise. The old version of himself would have calculated strategic advantage, would have assessed political implications, and made whatever choice maximized survival and stability. But that version died when Seraphina's blood touched his hands, and what remained was something more complicated. A weapon that remembered being human, a monster that couldn't quite forget what love felt like. A duke who'd learned that sometimes the hardest choice wasn't between right and wrong, but between two different kinds of destruction. "If I accept these terms." His voice was quiet. "If I call this a misunderstanding and move forward as the king's representative, I need one additional condition. Name it. Lord Ashwood leaned forward. The bloodstain in the square stays. No one cleans it. No one covers it. It remains exactly as it is, as a permanent reminder of what stability actually costs when you strip away all the comfortable lies. Future generations need to see evidence that the system we're building was purchased with lives that should have been protected instead of sacrificed. Eleanor smiled grimly. The king won't like that. The king can tolerate one permanent bloodstain if it means avoiding another rebellion. Cadrick's expression hardened. That's my condition. Accept it, or I continue fighting until there's nothing left except corpses and ruins. I'll present the terms. Eleanor moved toward the door. But Cadrick, you need to understand something. Accepting this means choosing to live with what you've done. No more pursuing death as penance. No more throwing yourself into impossible battles, hoping someone else makes the choice for you. You survive this. You commit to actually living instead of just enduring. The words hit like physical blows because she was right. Accepting victory meant abandoning the comfortable escape of martyrdom and instead facing decades of waking up, remembering that he'd executed someone he loved, started a war that killed thousands, and justified all of it by achieving political goals that would never quite balance the moral debt. Living with that sounded infinitely harder than dying in one final glorious gesture of defiance, which was probably why it was the right choice. I'll live with it, he said finally. God help me, I'll live with it. And maybe in 40 or 50 years, I'll have done enough good to justify the evil required to get here. Or maybe I'll die still trying to balance accounts that can never be balanced. Either way, it's better than adding more bodies to the count just because facing consequences scares me. The negotiations took 3 days of careful positioning and deliberate compromises that left both sides feeling like they'd won and lost simultaneously. The king got to save face by calling it a misunderstanding. Cadrick got genuine autonomy and authority to prevent future abuses. The bloodstain remained over royal objections, a permanent scar in the heart of Blackstone Keep that visitors would stare at for generations, while asking what really happened during the siege that changed everything. When the terms were finally signed and sealed, Lord Chancellor Blackwood departed with obvious relief. The siege camps dismantled. Royal forces withdrew beyond northern borders, with instructions to respect regional authority unless explicitly invited to intervene. And Cadrick stood in the square watching soldiers clean up the debris of war while carefully preserving the blood that wouldn't wash away no matter how much anyone wished otherwise. Eleanor found him there as sunset turned the mountains gold and crimson. You did it. Her voice carried satisfaction mixed with exhaustion. You forced the king to acknowledge limits on his authority, changed the balance of power across the entire kingdom, gave every territory hope that resistance is possible when pushed too far. I killed 6,000 people and called it progress. You saved future generations from having to make similar choices. There's a difference. Is there? He asked quietly. Or is that just what people tell themselves to justify atrocities in hindsight? Eleanor was silent for a moment, staring at the bloodstain that had become Blackstone's most defining feature. I don't know, but I know that if you hadn't fought, the system would have continued crushing anyone who questioned it. Now there's precedent. Evidence that even kings have limits when their own defenders decide submission costs more than resistance. That's worth something, even if the price was higher than anyone wanted to pay. Helena approached across the square, moving carefully like someone navigating a graveyard. She'd maintained perfect formal composure throughout the negotiations, but now in the aftermath, her control was visibly fraying. I'm leaving. Her voice was steady. Our marriage served its political purpose. We have the alliance and the autonomy. But I can't stay here watching you torture yourself over decisions I helped manufacture. You deserve the chance to rebuild without constant reminders of how thoroughly I betrayed you. Where will you go? Cadrick asked, surprised by how little he felt beyond mild curiosity. Back to Thornfield Estate. My father needs help managing the territory, and I need distance from the disaster I created trying to protect my family. She paused, her eyes finding his. For what it's worth, I am genuinely sorry. Not for the strategy, I'd make similar choices again under the same circumstances. But for the human cost, for using your capacity to care as a weapon against you. That was cruel in ways I didn't fully understand until I watched you nearly die defending a principle that should have gotten you killed. We're both guilty of using people as weapons. He gestured at the square. At least you have the excuse of following orders. I just decided 6,000 deaths were acceptable collateral damage to make a point. That's not what this was. Helena moved closer, her composure finally cracking completely. You fought because continuing to serve a system built on terror was unsustainable. That's not the same as using people as weapons. That's refusing to be used as one yourself. The distinction feels pretty thin when I'm standing in a square soaked with blood from people who followed me into a war that shouldn't have been necessary. Maybe. She reached up to touch his face with surprising gentleness. But those people made their own choices, Kaedric. They saw what you were willing to sacrifice and decided it was worth dying for. Don't dishonor them by assuming they were just following orders. They were choosing resistance over submission. That's not your guilt to carry alone. She left without waiting for a response, and Kaedric watched her go with the exhausted acceptance of someone who'd stopped expecting closure or redemption. The weeks that followed were rebuilding in all its unglamorous reality. Clearing rubble, treating wounded, counting dead, and trying to assign meaning to numbers that defied comprehension. The Northern Lords worked together with efficiency born from shared trauma, reorganizing governance structures to reflect their new autonomy while carefully avoiding conversations about whether the cost had been worthwhile. Kaedric threw himself into the work with mechanical determination, using physical exhaustion to drown out thoughts that surfaced whenever he stopped moving. He slept maybe 3 hours a night, waking from nightmares where Seraphina's execution merged with the siege's casualties, until he couldn't distinguish between different species of guilt. Eleanor caught him one morning in the archives where he'd gone searching for historical records on governmental reform. He looked skeletal, having lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, his eyes carrying shadows deep enough to drown in. "You're killing yourself." She said it like a diagnosis rather than accusation. Slowly, but definitely killing yourself through exhaustion and self-punishment disguised as dedication. "I'm working." His voice was flat. "These territories need functional governance structures before winter. We can't afford delays because I'm tired. The territories need a duke who's actually alive and functional rather than a ghost pretending to be human." She closed the ledger he'd been reviewing. "When's the last time you ate a full meal? Slept more than a few hours? Had a conversation about something other than logistics and reconstruction? Does it matter?" "Yes, it fucking matters." Eleanor's composure shattered in a way he'd never witnessed. "You survived the siege, Kaedric. You achieved the impossible and forced the king to acknowledge limits on his authority. But you're acting like you're still waiting for permission to die, because actually living with your choices is harder than pursuing martyrdom. What do you want from me?" His voice rose to match hers. "You want me to pretend I'm fine? That executing someone I loved and starting a war that killed thousands doesn't haunt every waking moment? I did monstrous things, Eleanor. I justified atrocities by claiming they served some greater purpose. And now I'm supposed to just accept victory and move on like the cost was somehow acceptable? No!" She slammed her hands on the table hard enough to make him flinch. "I want you to acknowledge that you're human. That humans make terrible choices under impossible circumstances, and then have to figure out how to live with the consequences. You want to torture yourself forever? Fine. But do it while actually living instead of this slow-motion suicide disguised as noble suffering." Her words echoed in the silent archives until the only sound was both of them breathing hard. "I don't know how to live with this." The admission came out broken. Every time I close my eyes, I see her face. Every time I walk through that square, I feel her blood on my hands. And every time someone thanks me for winning autonomy for the North, I want to scream that we paid for it with lives that should have been protected instead of sacrificed. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "Then find someone who can help you carry it. Find a way to transform guilt into something constructive. Build the kind of kingdom where future rulers don't have to make similar choices. Turn your suffering into purpose instead of just enduring it until death seems preferable." "How?" "I don't know." She moved around the table, standing close enough to touch if he'd allowed it. "But I know that Seraphina wouldn't have wanted this. Wouldn't have wanted you to destroy yourself over choices that were impossible from the beginning. She told you to remember being human with her, not to spend decades punishing yourself for briefly experiencing connection. You didn't know her." The words came out defensive. "No. But I knew you when you were with her. And that version of Kaedric would be furious watching you waste the survival she died protecting." The truth of that landed like a blade between ribs. Months passed. Winter came and buried the northern territories in snow that covered damaged sections of the keep like a shroud. The blood in the square froze into something permanent, ice mixing with oxidized iron until the stain became part of the architecture itself. Kaedric continued rebuilding with single-minded focus, implementing reforms that distributed power more evenly and created systems to prevent future abuses. He negotiated directly with the king on matters of trade and military cooperation, establishing precedents for regional autonomy that other territories began requesting. And slowly, grudgingly, he started accepting that survival might be less about finding redemption and more about learning to function despite permanent damage. On the anniversary of Seraphina's execution, he stood alone in the square at dawn, staring at ice-covered blood that had become Blackstone's most enduring monument. The cold burned his face, but he remained motionless, remembering 3 months when someone had looked at him like he was human and made him believe it might be true. Eleanor found him there an hour later, carrying 2 cups of something hot that steamed in the winter air. "You're going to freeze." She handed him a cup without asking if he wanted it. Maybe that would be easier. Maybe. "But she died so you could live, Kaedric. The least you can do is actually attempt it." He sipped the drink, letting warmth spread through him despite not deserving simple comforts. "Do you think it was worth it? All of it? The execution, the siege, the 6,000 dead. Do you think we built something worthy of that cost?" Eleanor was quiet for a long time, steam from her cup dissipating into frozen air. "I think we built something better than what existed before. Not perfect, not without permanent scars, but better. Whether that makes the cost worthwhile is a question every person who survived will have to answer for themselves." "And your answer?" She met his eyes, her expression mixing exhaustion and determination. "I think the kingdom needed to learn that loyalty purchased through terror isn't actually loyalty. I think future generations will benefit from precedents we established. And I think that even if the cost was higher than anyone wanted, fighting was preferable to continued submission. So yes, it was worth it, but I get to carry less guilt than you do. My answer might be different if I'd personally executed someone I loved." He nodded slowly, accepting that there were no clean answers. No moment when the moral accounting would balance. Just decades of waking up and choosing to do better with the survival purchased at such terrible cost. Years passed. The Northern Territories flourished under genuine autonomy, implementing reforms that distributed power more evenly and created systems to prevent the kind of abuse that had sparked rebellion. Other regions watched and began demanding similar arrangements, citing Blackstone's precedent as justification for regional self-governance. The king aged into something more cautious, having learned that absolute authority lasted only until his own defenders decided the cost of submission outweighed the risk of resistance. He never forgave Kaedric for forcing that lesson, but he also never again attempted the kind of terror-based control that had characterized his earlier reign. And Duke Kaedric Ravenscar ruled Blackstone Keep with ruthless efficiency, tempered by hard-won understanding of what power actually cost when you stripped away comfortable illusions. He never remarried, never found someone who could replace what he'd lost. But he built a legacy anyway, not through personal happiness, but through systematic dismantling of structures that sacrificed the vulnerable to maintain stability for the powerful. The bloodstain remained in the square, exactly as he'd demanded. Visitors would stare at it and ask what happened there, and the answer became legend. Some versions cast him as a hero who fought tyranny. Others painted him as a monster who'd murdered his way to power. The truth, as always, existed somewhere between the extremes in territory too complicated for simple narratives. 20 years after the siege, Eleanor found him standing in that square again at dawn, older now, but still carrying the same shadows behind his eyes. "You're still punishing yourself." She'd aged too, gray threading through her hair and lines marking her face. "After 2 decades of building something genuinely better, you're still standing here torturing yourself over the cost. Some costs don't stop haunting you just because time passes." His voice carried the weight of years spent trying to justify choices that couldn't be justified. "I built a better system, Eleanor. Distributed power. Protected the vulnerable. Changed how the entire kingdom functions. And none of it brings back the people who died making it possible. No, it doesn't." She stood beside him, both of them staring at blood that had survived 20 winters. But those people died believing their sacrifice served a purpose. Don't dishonor them by deciding that purpose was meaningless just because you can't forgive yourself. "Do you think she would have?" He asked the question that had haunted him for 2 decades. "If she could see what I built from her death, would she think it was worth the cost?" Eleanor considered carefully before responding. I think she understood that some prices are too high to be justified, but still necessary to pay. That's what she told you in that garden, wasn't it? To let her go so you could stay human enough to make her sacrifice mean something. He nodded slowly, remembering that final conversation with crystal clarity, despite 20 years of trying to bury the memory. She told me to remember being human with her, not to become the monster completely. And have you? Eleanor asked gently. Have you stayed human enough to make it meaningful? Kedrick looked around the square, seeing not just bloodstains, but evidence of everything built afterward. Merchants conducting business in a marketplace that functioned without corruption. Children playing in spaces that had been battlegrounds. Lords governing with accountability instead of terror, because precedents established during the siege made abuse of power genuinely risky. I don't know. The admission felt like release. I wake up every day still carrying guilt that will never fully balance. Still wondering if I could have found some other way that cost less. But I also see evidence that fighting mattered, that refusing submission changed things in ways that will outlast my lifetime. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it has to be. Maybe it does. Eleanor smiled sadly. The Duke they called Monster learned to be human by choosing resistance over submission. And the woman who helped him remember his humanity died protecting his ability to make that choice meaningful. That's not a fairy tale with a happy ending, but it's honest. And honesty was always what you both valued most. They stood together in the square as dawn broke across the northern valleys. Two people who'd survived by becoming harder than circumstances demanded, and then spent decades trying to soften the damage without losing the strength that kept them alive. Kedrick never stopped missing Serafina, never stopped carrying guilt over choices that had seemed impossible at the time and remained unforgivable in retrospect. But he learned to function despite permanent damage, channeling suffering into purpose that might someday justify the cost. The bloodstain in the square remained through his death 30 years later and beyond, a permanent monument to the siege that changed everything. Historians would debate for centuries whether Duke Kedrick Ravenscar was hero or monster, liberator or tyrant, visionary or madman consumed by guilt. The truth, as always, was simpler and more complicated than any single narrative could capture. He was a weapon that learned to wield itself, then discovered too late that being human was infinitely more painful than remaining a monster. He was a duke who loved someone enough to execute her when ordered, then loved her memory enough to burn the kingdom that demanded such sacrifice. He was proof that sometimes refusing to submit changed everything, and sometimes the cost of that change was so high that victory and defeat became indistinguishable. But standing in that blood-stained square, watching dawn break across territories that had learned to value genuine loyalty over coerced submission, one thing remained clear. The kingdom survived him. The people survived him. And the precedents established through suffering that should never have been necessary created a foundation for governance that protected the vulnerable instead of sacrificing them to maintain comfortable stability for the powerful. Whether that justified the cost was a question each person would answer differently. But it was real, built on blood and sacrifice and choices that couldn't be taken back. And in a world where power usually demanded submission or death, sometimes real change purchased at terrible cost was the only victory available to weapons that remembered being human.